Good afternoon. Welcome to the show. This is the Orion Talk Radio Network. You're against the wall, and this is JJink, otherwise known as James Freeland. I am joined today with by Popeye from FederalJack.com, and also by James Fetzer, PhD professor and 9/11 JFK scholar. And being that it's the 10th anniversary, it's almost impossible to just pick a place to start. I mean, all the official investigations begin with the ending of the hijacking and the planes crashing, assuming that what we were told led up to that point is true. So I guess we're going to start off today by discussing, here we are 10 years later, and I see pieces, Mr. Fetzer, we see pieces on BBC coming up where they're actually are looking at bringing some of the movement on TV, and I'm not really sure how good it is. You get a lot of what you say gets thrown on the cutting room floor. I mean, you were on this interview with BBC, this documentary. You're featured in it also. What are your views on how they actually cover this and what the end result really was? I mean, because essentially they tried to shoot down all the simplest of the theories.
Yeah, well, thanks, JJ. It was my second round. The BBC had been here before. They came to my home 3 years ago. Guy Smith, who's the director, actually interviewed me here for 8 hours in my home. And when the first documentary was broadcast, I discovered that out of that 8 hours, they'd used about 7.5 minutes of me. They'd also interviewed Alex Jones, and they used about 4 minutes of him. Dylan Avery about 3.5, where it was pretty clear that they were trading on stereotypes and trying to make out that Dylan was the obnoxious kid, that Alex was the messianic preacher, and I was the kooky professor. Even my wife might agree with that, by the way.
That's debatable, right?
But the fact of the matter is, they devoted very little attention to logic and evidence. I mean, I'd given them dozens and dozens of arguments. I mean, there's a nice summary of 20 findings that refute the official account you can find on the Scholars homepage, 911scholars.org, in the upper left-hand corner. Why doubt 9/11? So that I was, not very, very happy with it. They were really trading on the psychology of belief and why people might believe these have these weird ideas. And, of course, they do seem strange until you actually look at the evidence. So I was contacted, a few months ago, about 4 months ago, to whether I would be willing to do another interview. And this time I talked to Mike Rudin, who actually is in charge he's the producer of the Conspiracy Files series. So I explained to him that I hadn't been very happy with what had happened before, but that if they wanted to do it right, that I had a tremendous amount of evidence to discuss, and that they could really produce a blockbuster. So he came out here and interviewed me this time for 4 hours. And the new piece, which is Conspiracy Files 9/11, 10 years on, which in British parlance means 10 years after or 10 years later, featured again Dylan Avery, Alex Jones, and me, this time with Niels Herret, who's a Danish professor of chemistry who's been involved in research with Steve Jones and Kevin Ryan and all that on the nanothermite
He independently found nanothermite.
Or something in the dust, right? Yeah. So while I and Mark Hightower have done a lot of research on the thermite thing and found that it really doesn't live up to its billing, that it cannot have been what was responsible for blowing the buildings apart. It doesn't have the ability to pulverize concrete or demolish steel. So, it's what went along with. I mean, nanothermite's an incendiary, can be used to cut steel, JJ, but it can't. It's feeble as an explosive. It has less than 13% of the explosive force of TNT, for example.
Right, and all that does is explain the molten metal and the high temperatures. That doesn't explain particulate matter
I particularly think they used the barometric bombs that I told you about, Jim. I particularly think they used those, nanothermite, in conjunction with C4 and a bunch of other stuff. Those buildings were reinforced too much to come down the way they did with just one simple explosive. Just like the whole plot of 9/11 itself, there was more than one thing involved. It's as simple as that.
I think you're right, Popeye. I think you're right about that. That it was
the thing of it is, guys, before we go any further, is let's just assume, let's assume that there was, I mean, literally before 9/11, most of these hijackers, they were like intelligence VIPs. They were given free passes. They were housed at, they were taken to CIA safe houses and housed on military bases. I mean, they were being red flagged all over the world and just being let through here and let through there. And they must have thought, what a grand thing. But now let's just assume just for a minute that there was no Mossad help. There was no help from the CIA. There was no help from anywhere inside Department of Defense, NORAD, none of these. What we would have had is, if the hijackings even could have occurred with these $4 box cutters, essentially they would have been like pencils. They would have had, they would have maybe hit their targets. That is highly doubtful in itself that these pilots could have hit
these guys
buildings.
couldn't fly a Cessna. It's ridiculous. The whole thing's absurd. Pilots, about a dozen pilots tried to hit a twin tower in simulators, and they couldn't do it. I think Rob Basalmo maybe did it one time out of 10, which is part of the reason why I'm inclined to believe that they had to fake the planes in New York. We know no plane crashed in Shanksville, and there's more than enough evidence that no Boeing 757 at least, hit the Pentagon. Exactly. New York is a very tricky case because we have, for example, in the case of Flight 175, this video, but it has these peculiar features that the plane is traveling 560 miles an hour at 700 to 1,000 feet altitude, which is actually aerodynamically impossible for a 767. And it passes into the building effortlessly. You'd expect a collision. If a car hits an enormous tree, you don't expect the car to pass effortlessly through the tree any more than you would expect a huge airliner that's actually intersecting 8 different floors. It's on an angle. To have passed effortlessly into the building. It should have crumpled, its wings and tail broken off, body seats, luggage falling to the ground. The engines would have penetrated the building. But what you actually see is
the infamous silhouette.
The whole plane gets into the building before there's any explosion. That's preposterous. But they needed that, you see, to have a pseudo explanation for the collapse of the building. Now the buildings don't collapse. The fires didn't burn long enough or hot enough. The steel was too strong.
Just so everybody knows, straight down is the path of most resistance.
That's exactly right. Below the alleged hit points, those buildings were stone cold steel. And it was tapered. It was like 6 inches thick at the base, the core columns, and 5'4". It worked up to a 1/2 and 1/4 inch at the top. I have a physics, chemistry, math instructor who calculated the relative mass of the steel in the North Tower, and above the alleged hit point was only 1.4% of the steel. And the idea that it could have overcome the lower 98.6 is simply absurd. I mean, the government has just been lying, through its anal aperture. It's unreal how much smoke has been blown.
Touching on what you were talking about with the video, this is something that really a lot of people get divided in the 9/11 truth movement. The people that say there's no plane at the Pentagon get lumped in and get called no planers because there are people that...
Well, I don't believe a plane hit the Pentagon.
Well, neither do I, but wait, listen. This is the key thing. I think Jim is correct that the video evidence was tampered with. Okay, yes. And the reason I think it was tampered with was to cover up what they really flew into those buildings. I believe something hit them because I live there, and trust me, I have pictures. You see turbines on the and there's an engine part right on the ground outside, and this was literally within 20 minutes. Okay. Of taking photos. There was feet and stuff on the ground, and it wasn't a very big engine. It wasn't a huge airline engine. It was a very small one. I think that it was a computer-guided military drone, and they used a video, whatever video fakery there is, it's to cover up and make it look like it was a plane, and so that they can't say, see, it's a drone.
And that's one theory, but the one thing that we first of all, this is the end of the segment. We'll be coming into the break, so just some food to chew on. Physics would not allow for that building to fall. Any one of those buildings in 10 seconds or 7 seconds, where you're talking about the Salomon Brothers building, into its own footprint through the path of most resistance. Physics won't allow that without a vacuum to be created from the floor below. So boom, 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 boom. All right. Well, welcome back to the show. This is the Orion Talk Network. I don't think I'll be taking calls this show. There's just too much to talk about. During the break, Dr. Fetzer, you were talking to me a little bit about this documentary the BBC put out. So
yeah.
Why don't we just go right into it?
Yeah, well, it was great, JJ, because seeing this documentary confirmed my suspicions about the first and made me realize that the BBC is profoundly complicit in the cover-up. I mean, after this documentary, there's no way around it. I've actually published an article on Veterans Today and also my blog entitled The BBC's Instrument of 9/11 Misinformation. Because let me use the Pentagon as a nice example. I'd explained to Guy Smith 3 years ago and to Mike Rudin again here when he came for a second round that the hit point at the Pentagon is on the ground floor, that there's a chain link fence, that the opening is only about 10 feet high, 16 or 17 feet wide, far too small for a 100-ton airliner that has a 125-foot wingspan. It's 155 feet long, and a tail stands 44 feet above the ground. You have unbroken windows all around it. You got enormous spools of cable. You got a couple of cars. What you don't have is a massive pile of debris. What you don't have are broken wings. You don't have. You know what? Tail.
One thing else that I just realized that I was just turned on to real recently was there was a woman who walked out the hole with an infant in her arms from before the collapse of the rest of that first section. You know what I mean? When it was
That's
just
right.
a hole.
That was April Gallup. Yes. What she's got to say. She looked around. She saw no indication of any plane having crashed there. That's exactly what Jamie McIntyre for CNN said when he got there. The anchor was asking him about the plane crash. He said, well, you might think that, but there's no indication of any plane having crashed anywhere near the Pentagon. And he goes on about that. Later, under pressure, evidently, he was induced to say anyone would be, stupid to think no plane had hit the Pentagon. But that's what he was telling us at the time. So what they did, and I explained to them that there's a misconception that sometimes a second floor location is identified as the hit point, and that it was important not to confound them. So what they did when I was talking about the hit point was show photographs, images, film of the second floor hit point. So, this is a wonderfully simple technique that they would then repeat, because I said there's also this very wonderful photograph showing the civilian lime green fire trucks extinguishing the very modest fires at the hit point. And you can see the Pentagon lawn. It's clear, green, smooth, unblemished, no debris.
Sure doesn't look like thousands and thousands of gallons of aviation fuel all over the place burning, does it?
Right. Doesn't look like anything crashed there. So what did they do? They juxtaposed, when I'm talking about the smooth green lawn, with other footage and film taken later when some debris starts to show up. And in fact, I also explained to them how I'd been trying to sort out where this debris could have come from, since it clearly wasn't there after the plane had crashed and the civilian lime green fire trucks are putting it out. And that it seemed to me it would have been too awkward, too obvious to have officers and enlisted men come carrying pieces of debris out onto the Pentagon lawn.
It was off limits. They sealed it off.
But if that had come floating down from the sky, see, there was a C-130 that was circling the building.
Oh, you're all right. Witnesses.
So I believe that it was there to dump this debris on the Pentagon lawn. So how did they deal with that? Well, they interviewed the captain of the C-130, a lieutenant colonel by the name of Orion, who said how he was offended. He was offended that anyone would suggest he had a part of this.
Well, and that plane flew low enough where, if you recall, there's been interviews with people at the gas station and a couple of other places along the way. The route that it took, it was low enough to mistake for the other jet. So, debris could have been thrown from it, and it's well documented that this plane was flying around.
Remember, we don't want to mix the two different planes. It does appear that a large commercial carrier, a 757, flew toward the Pentagon on a due easterly trajectory. Is 300 feet in the air too high to hit any of the lampposts that, according to the official count, the Flight 77 hit, coming in at a rather acute angle to the Pentagon, just barely skimming the ground at over 500 miles an hour, which turns out to be another aerodynamic impossibility. And this plane, when it was a second from impact with the building, was 100 feet too high and swerved over it. where pilots for 9/11 Truth obtained black box data from the National Transportation Safety Board, which it said had come from Flight 77, and this is exactly what they found. When you made a proper adjustment for altitude, that the plane was 300 feet in the air and that it had swerved over the building. Interestingly, JJ and Popeye, a friend of mine from JFK Research by the name of Roy Schaefer had a buddy who's a trucker by the name of Dave Ball, who was in front of the Pentagon and who had written Roy to tell him he saw a big plane fly toward the building and then swerve over it. So I said, Roy, look, I'd really like to get Dave on the air. Can you get him to come on my show? And he talked to Dave. He said, well, Dave was real worried. I didn't want to talk about it. And I was explaining to Roy that you're much safer after you get your story out. And in fact, a couple of weeks later, he was found dead in an abandoned building. Now, the point you're making, JJ, is that CIT, the Citizens Investigation Team, also went out to track down witnesses because in relation to these two different trajectories, the official ground skimming acute angle trajectory versus the 300 feet in the air coming at due east, in between is a Citgo station. So that if witnesses report whether the plane came in north or south of the Citgo, if it came in north, it would confirm the alternative 300 feet in the air swerving over. If it came in south, it would confirm the official trajectory, and the witnesses they found one after another all confirmed it was north of the Citgo station. And they even talked and interviewed this fellow Lloyd England, who was a cab driver there, whose cab allegedly had been hit by one of the lampposts. And it was a very curious interview because you could really tell from the equivocal way in which Lloyd was answering questions that he was under the thumb, that people had induced him to go along with his story, that he knew better. But he changed
his story from the story that he told right after 9/11 to the story he told in that interview. And you could, I saw that exact documentary, and it's just, I couldn't believe. I mean, because the guy, you were showing him pictures of his cab. That's your cab. That's your cab right now. That's not my cab. It's like, I saw the interview. Well, so it's funny how I would rather look like you would rather look like a moron.
That was the same interview I referenced to you, Jim, in one of our earlier interviews where the two cops, the interviewer says that the two cops that were pointing out the path of the plane coming over where they saw, and that it differed from the official path of the plane coming into the Pentagon, they were reprimanded by their higher-ups for appearing in this video and being, interviewed by this guy. It's the same one. I know exactly what you're talking about, JJ.
Yeah. In the United States today, if you speak the truth, you're in trouble.
No, of course. It's better to be a lying sack of crap.
Yeah, and just look outright like a moron, show you a picture of your car and say, no, that's not my car. Yet you're standing in front of it. That's you. No, that's not me or my car.
So anyone who wants more details about this BBC thing should simply Google the BBC's instrument of 9/11 misinformation or put in Veterans Today, Jim Fetzer, and you go to a list of all my articles. But I also pointed out that we've seen earlier cases where the BBC was caught with its pants down, including on 9/11, late in the afternoon at 4:57, Jane Standley of BBC announced that the Solomon Brothers building, which was another name for WTC-7, had collapsed. But that wouldn't actually happen for 23 minutes longer. And in fact, over Jane Standley's shoulder, her left shoulder, you can see WTC-7 in the background. So this is a stunning example where they got ahead of the script of collusion between the intelligence agencies and the mass media. I mean, absolutely stunning.
Yeah, and none of these things make it into any investigation. Let's stick with Building 7 for a few minutes.
Sure.
All right. Well, actually, we'll come back to Building 7. Stand by. This is the Orion Talk Radio Network. We'll be back after this message. All right, that's Pokerface, pokerface.com. Welcome back to the show. You're Against the Wall. I am your host, JJink. Welcome back to the Orion Talk Radio Network. I'd like to say hello to everybody out there at Micro 1650 AM. Big shot of the milliwatt. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Everyone local near me in Syracuse, upstate New York area. Thanks for listening. Thanks, guys. Okay, before the break, Building 7 came up. Now, in regards to the World Trade Center complex, the entire complex, there are a few peculiar things. For instance, Larry Silverstein had just leased from the Port Authority the World Trade Center complex. Now, both the towers, the north and the south tower, both needed estimated $1 billion in asbestos abatement done, not to mention other maintenance and upgrades. One of the only ways, and then Building 7, of course, Building 7 housed the CIA, the FEC, or the SEC, Giuliani's bunker, his command bunker.
The CIA.
The CIA.
It's one of the largest offices. This is one of the most important things to remember. Building 7 housed one of the largest CIA offices out in the country outside of Langley, Virginia.
Yes.
But that building was built to collapse due to fire alone. Just remember
there's one thing we know. If there's one thing we learned from Oklahoma City, we know that government agencies will store high explosives, even in a building with a daycare center. They don't care. You couldn't do it, but they will do it. Now, as far as the asbestos abatement, now there are many reasons why you might file a fraudulent insurance scam or claim. A couple of $1 billion in maintenance costs might be one of them, to destroy records from investigations into Wall Street bankers and corporations like Enron, possibly. So anyways, with that said, Dr. Fetzer, what are the most peculiar parts of Building 7? We'll talk about that through this segment. Then we can go into the towers a little bit. And then later on, we'll talk about how there's no way that any of this could have happened unless key things like the intercept and shoot down orders from NORAD have been changed. Drills were run. So we'll go into that in a little while. Rest assured, anybody who's listening, we will cover these things. We'll stick to Building 7 right now.
Well, JJ, Building 7 appears to me to have been one of the most robust structures ever erected by the hand of man. I offer you a couple of indications why.
Densely populated by spooks.
Well, it was constructed over two enormous electrical generators providing electricity for Lower Manhattan, so it was designed to never collapse. The steel they used in Building 7 was solid steel. Even in the Twin Towers, they used these massive steel beams, but they were hollowed out in the center, which provide nearly as much support. But in Building 7, they were solid steel beams. The only explosive whatever in the building were some diesel fuel tanks. And while the suggestion has been made that might have been the cause of the destruction of the building, that can't be the case. Diesel is non-explosive and only burns at a low temperature. There was modest, very limited damage to WTC-7 from the destruction of buildings 1 and 2. And the fires were, very minimal. Barry Jennings, who was an emergency management
Isn't it funny, Dr. Fetzer, that it's been proven that one of the fires we've seen from a different angle of Building 7 happened to be the SEC office?
That's pretty telling, JJ, because there's a lot of speculation. A principal reason for destroying Building 7 was to get rid of all the SEC's documents and records related to investigations. All the Enron files were there, and apparently others that could have potentially represent billions in damages and so forth that could have resulted in criminal prosecution. So it looks to me very much as though that was a major motive here. But the fact of the matter is the building in its destruction displayed all the characteristics of a classic controlled demolition. All the floors fell at the same time. You had that characteristic kink at the top, which comes from removing one of the main support columns to ensure if it falls anywhere other than straight down, it will be inward. It came down at 6.6 seconds. Approximately the speed of free fall, which means there was no resistance whatsoever to the collapse of that building. And when it was over, JJ, there was a stack of pancakes equal to about 12% the height of the building. That's what has been discovered from experience with controlled demolitions. You get a residue about equal to 12% of the original. So since it was 47 floors,
and a pile of debris ready to be loaded,
4.7 with another 2/10, so it would have been about 5 floors. So that's about what we have here. Contrast with Twin Towers, destroyed below ground level. All the floors remained stationary. They were being converted into millions of cubic yards of very fine dust from the top down. Completely different.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, on top of the Deutsche Bank, they found particulate bone matter. That means there was something so energetic that it turned bone, not to fragments or even to dust, to particulate matter.
Yeah.
And that's from a free fall, gravity-driven collapse.
Allegedly, right.
Allegedly.
Everything's turned to dust
here. Why is it? What I don't get is when you look at it like that, it's so laughable. I have a hard time even understanding how somebody could look at me and think I am nuts for thinking that building isn't a gravity-driven collapse in 10 seconds, 115 or 110 floors to the ground, almost ready to just be loaded up into chunks on trucks, ready to be moved out.
I know, and Giuliani had, 140 dump trucks all lined up. And what people don't notice is those
happen to be there.
I know, in New York, that would take, months of advance, to get that many dump trucks lined up for a project would take months of planning in advance, and yet he had them there at the drop of a hat or at the drop of a building. And what many people don't realize is those dump trucks were not only taking out steel, they were bringing in massive quantities of dirt. So that Judy Wood has documented the photographs from the World Trade Center afterwards, and it's actually growing in its size and dimensions because all this dirt is being dumped on it, which appears to have been a way of coping with however it was they destroyed the Twin Towers. Something very strange was going on there.
Well, here's an interesting caveat. At Fresh Kills over in Staten Island where they were dumping all the debris and stuff, that wasn't sold to China and Japan and everywhere else. The ground, because of all the soup of all the crap that was, in the dust and everything that had just been obliterated, it created a radioactive soup. And if you go back, there's a movie where it's very telling. It's this independent documentary, and the first responders are talking about it, and the interviewer didn't really pick up on it and kind of left it. But these two cops are talking, these two detectives. It's on Friday's show, I played clips from it. It's called Dust to Dust, The Health Effects of 9/11. And these two detectives are talking, and they're talking how their job was they spent like 5 months out at Fresh Kills. And they said when they were walking around, he was trying to figure out how, because he got sick, and they were trying to figure out he was exposed to the PCBs and everything that are inside the jet fuel, and like benzene and all that, and they said how are you exposed to benzene, and how are you exposed to radiation? And the one guy, he was like, I don't remember being exposed to that. And his friend looked at him and said, what, are you crazy? You don't remember being exposed to benzene and radiation? You remember the green bubbling stuff over at Fresh Kills? That was radiation bubbling up. And the interviewer never asked him, what do you mean there was radiation bubbling up at the ground at Fresh Kills?
What did they think? Fresh Kills was a nuclear test site?
Right. Where did the radiation come from?
It was imported from the World Trade Center. I mean, this is so absurd. It's hard to believe. There were elevated levels of tritium, of deuterium, and even of strontium at the ground zero, which highly suggests nuclear devices were involved.
Well, listen. The fact is that now, unless those buildings, well, first of all, unless they planned this from the early 70s when they built those two buildings. It would have had to have been something fast-acting, something very, very effective, something that could be done quickly, set up. Because as we know, there were many floors that were closed off for weeks at a time, where all offices were emptied out of them throughout for months, before 9/11. So when people say, "Well, there's no way to rig that building," well, there had to have been a way, because physics does not allow. The laws, not theories, the laws of physics and gravity, relativity, Einstein theorized by gravity, the path of most resistance.
What's physics, JJ? That doesn't apply to 9/11. Stop that.
All right, stand by. This is the Orion Talk Radio Network. You guys are so silly.
JJ, see science talk with physics.
7th grade education, guys.
Love it.
Okay, well, here we go. We're back from the break. This is the Orion Talk Radio Network. You're Against the Wall. We've been having a lovely, lovely discussion about 9/11. We're talking about Building 7 in the World Trade Center complex right now. During the break, we were talking a little bit about John Kennedy. That'll be just a little teaser for maybe an upcoming show or something. So we'll go back. First of all, we were talking about Fresh Kill, and we were talking about how they just totally disrupted, first of all, the chain of investigation for a fire or for a crime investigation, but also the chain of custody or the evidence, the chain of custody for evidence. All the rules for a criminal investigation were broken that day, and so Building 7 specifically, that building came down.
Well, the point you were making, JJ, about and Popeye about the radioactivity out of fresh kills is very important, because there's epidemiological data, meaning the distribution of illness after 9/11, that very much conforms to what you would expect after a nuclear attack like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You had many first responders suffering from various kinds of cancer, including leukemia. A lot of them have already died. Of course, the dust that they were breathing was toxic, even though Christy Whitman, who was the head of the EPA, assured the public that it was safe to breathe. That she knew better. She was under orders.
She's a criminal. She's a criminal for that. You know what? A federal judge in like 2006 found that she is not immune from prosecution, and it said something along the lines of what she said. The judge said, pretty much that what she said to the press and the way she just lied like that was just irresponsible and just boggles the mind pretty much. So when you have a judge blown away by lies from the media and from a government official, you know that things are bad.
Yes, things are bad.
The official story comes apart at the seams. Anywhere you punch into it.
JJ, I haven't found a seam at which it does not come apart.
That's what I was going to say. Anywhere you punch into it, it just unravels.
Everything the government has told us about 9/11 has been false, and it's obviously been promulgated deliberately, which means the government's been lying to us from the beginning to the end.
The only thing they've said that's been accurate is when Bush came out and said that you shouldn't tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories about 9/11. He was completely accurate. He was talking about the government's outrageous.
That's right.
That 19 schmucks in a cave could do all this. It's impossible.
That's right. You got that one exactly right. It's just stunning. I mean, go to 9/11 Scholars again in that upper left-hand corner of Why Doubt 9/11, 20 refutations. And if you want more, go to the right-hand corner where there's a link to patriotsquestion911.com, where you'll find bio sketches, photographs, and statements by thousands of professionals across the disciplines of the hard sciences, the soft sciences, the humanities, the government, intelligence, military. I'm telling you, the breadth and depth of knowledge about 9/11 and that it was a complete fraud and a sham. It was a staged event. You were talking about the Pentagon, JJ. When those civilian lime green fire trucks put out those very modest fires at the actual alleged hit point, though no plane actually hit there, I was puzzled why later in the afternoon, when the rumor circulated that the Capitol might be next, all the members of Congress rushed out onto the steps in front of the Capitol, and they looked across the Potomac and they saw billowing black clouds coming up from the Pentagon. So I looked into that and discovered they were coming from a series of enormous dumpsters in front of the Pentagon. They weren't from the building at all. It was a Hollywood-style special effect.
And incidentally, a lot of people ask over and over endlessly, what happened? Well, first of all, the people that know, what happened to the $2.3 trillion that was declared unaccounted for just before 9/11? Well, there's no way that we're ever going to know, because if you look at the picture of that little hole in the Pentagon, if you look back, one of those offices back in the outer or in the inner ring is the office. It was almost a pinpoint bullseye laser target to the office with the records of that $2.3 trillion, not like $530, $2.3 trillion.
Dude, you lose $20 of your boss's money, I guarantee you'll get fired. You lose, you're a government official and you can't account for $2.3 trillion to the taxpayers. Don't worry about it. It's on the tab. Don't worry about it.
Yeah,
they get a promotion. Nobody's even been fired.
The controller of the Pentagon at the time, who's the chief financial officer, was Dov Zakheim, who's not only a joint U.S.-Israeli citizen, he also run companies that do those remote control devices for aircraft, among his other interesting pastimes, okay? But that Rumsfeld would announce the missing $2.3 trillion on a Monday is really stunning by itself, because any experienced Washington politician knows that if you do that early in the week, reporters are going to follow it. It's going to grow legs and become a big story. It's as though he anticipated something was going to occur in the meanwhile that was going to obliterate that $2.3 trillion from consciousness, and he'd be able to waltz into the halls of Congress and ask for hundreds of billions more in defense spending, which is exactly what he did the next day.
Well, interesting factoid. The spot that the Pentagon was hit was the only reinforced spot in the Pentagon that would have withstood an attack such as a cruise missile or a massive airliner. I'm doing air quotes, an airliner hitting it, okay? And it just happened to be the spot where Donald Rumsfeld told all the people in the Pentagon accounting department that were involved in this investigation, and anybody that was involved in it throughout the Pentagon, okay? Anybody that was involved in the investigation and knew about all this money being spent on black ops and all this other stuff that it wasn't supposed to be spent on, he was playing the part of the newly appointed Secretary of Defense who's concerned. And he set up a meeting with all these people and made sure he told them to bring all the evidence so he could see it. And do you know where he had the meeting scheduled for? On that side of the Pentagon. Do you know when? Great. In the morning of 9/11. Do you know most of the people that died in the Pentagon were those people? Oh, wow. Isn't that a coincidence? But I'm supposed to just say, those terrorists, those darn terrorists with their laptop, man, they can surely screw over a multi-billion-dollar defense agency, huh? They get right through they can spy right on us, I guess, with superpowers. I guess they use that movie-type hacking where they just move their fingers really fast on the keyboard and stuff scrolls on the screen, and all of a sudden they're listening in to some hidden bug in the room somewhere. So Al-Qaeda from a cave can outwit all of this and pull off 9/11. Sure. Did they tell Rumsfeld to put those people in the Pentagon in that specific spot? You know? Did they go? Let me ask you a question. Think about that for a second. Think about that, Jim? The absurdity of that, the way they want you to think about that like Al-Qaeda was doing Rumsfeld a favor.
That's right, doing Rumsfeld a favor, right.
So do you think they were like, well, we're going to attack, but let's help out Donald. Like
the 17 anti-terrorist drills that were going on that morning that were all being coordinated, that completely disrupted normal reactions, that guaranteed that no American fighter planes would go up to intercept any of those alleged hijacked aircraft, two of which, by the way, Flight 11 and 77, were not even scheduled to fly that day. And where the other two, the planes corresponding to Flight 93 and 175, I have the FAA data that shows that those planes were not decommissioned until 2005, which means that two of those planes weren't scheduled to fly that day, and two others were in the air long after 9/11.
There's video of, I think it was 175, Flight 175, after it had crashed into the tower. It was still flying, like there's video of, they're talking about how the second tower's already been hit and blah, 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 blah. And there's this, and the news cuts to the FAA. And as you see the FAA screen, you see Flight 175 flying around New York City. And it's just doing U-turns.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. First of all, some facts are this. There's no way that 4 jets could have flown off course had not the rules of engagement for interception been changed. Okay, that could not have happened prior to just very close to 9/11.
Rumsfeld had that changed in June, JJ. He had it changed in June, so you had to have permission of the Secretary of Defense. And then for 2 hours on 9/11, he was unavailable. No one had any idea where he was. And the next thing you know, he's out on the lawn helping to carry casualties. What is the Secretary of Defense, if America's under attack, doing out on the lawn?
Yeah, why is the chain of command, somebody who's vital in the chain of command that could give had the only person that could give the shoot-down order? Remember, that's the way they had changed everything. It used to be it used to be fast response and a slow response, and then they went, but right before 9/11, it went to the slow response, and then the way they fixed it was to go back to the way it was before Rumsfeld had touched it months before 9/11.
That's right. That's right.
Our defenses now are superior air defenses since 9/11. Are the exact same SOPs they were before 9/11.
Let me mention, by the way, before we go to the break, that this article of mine about the BBC's instrument of 9/11 misinformation, which you can find many places now, was co-authored with Joshua Blakeney, who is a journalist who writes for Veterans Today. He's a 9/11 activist. He's also a graduate student at the University of Lethbridge who's working on a thesis on the origins of the global war on terror. And I tell you, this guy has made some discoveries that I have found quite fascinating about where all this came from. And I think you and your guests are going to enjoy it very much. And I'm looking forward to coming back for the last hour. And I'm delighted to have been here for the first. And you're going to enjoy Joshua.
Yeah, I'm excited. I was talking to Joshua yesterday off air, getting ready for today's show, and he is a plethora of information. He's the only person I know of that's actually getting his master's degree, in this and doing a thesis based on 9/11 as a false flag operation. So very interesting stuff.
You're going to have a great time, and I'll join you and JJ for the last hour.
Thanks for coming on, Jim. It's been a blast.
My great pleasure. See you. Talk to you in just a while.
Okay, well, stand by. This is the end of the first hour. We'll be right back in a few minutes for the second hour. This is the Orion Talk Radio Network. Got a little bit better. I defer to you, Popeye. And yes, the cat's out of the bag. This is the Orion Talk Radio Network. No calls this show. Sorry, guys. Tuesday morning, I'll take calls on that show. Thanks to Dr. Fetzer for being on for the first hour. He'll be back on, the last hour?
Yeah, Jim's going to be back on the last hour with us.
All right, take it. Take it away, Popeye.
Pick up another interview really quick. Guys, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome to the show Joshua Blakeney. And he is a very interesting individual, to say the least. He is a very well-researched individual when it comes to the war on terror, 9/11, and, all that. And I think it's really important for him to be able to meet everybody and get his voice heard. So, Josh, tell the audience, just give them a quick tidbit about yourself, and then tell them what, in your research, there's new stuff that you've come out with. Because some of the stuff that, I've seen, I've been on your website, and some of the stuff that you've come across and you've brought to light is just it backs up what a lot of other people have been saying, and you actually get more in depth than anybody else I know. So, and since you're actually majoring, you're trying to get your master's degree, or not trying, I should say, you are getting your master's degree in this subject and writing a whole thesis about 9/11 as a false flag event and everything. Go ahead and just take over.
Okay, well, thanks for having me on your show. I guess in 2005, I've been growing up in England my whole life, and in 2005, my mother came in and told me we're going to go and live in Canada. We immigrated to Canada. I turned up in the city of Lethbridge, which is quite close to the 49th parallel, the Montana-Alberta border, the city of Lethbridge, to attend the University of Lethbridge, which I enrolled in, I guess, from September 2006. And I walked into a class entitled Globalization Since 1492, which is provided by a professor by the name of Anthony J. Hall at the University of Lethbridge. I entered that class in 2007. And Professor Hall had begun to look into 9/11 around that time. He's a well-known activist involved in Native American rights, and in he was in Quebec City at the famous anti-globalization protest there. And so he's a well-known activist that gets on a lot of mainstream media and so on. And so he sort of took me under his wing when he saw that I was someone who had a passion for social justice issues, and began to, lend me books pertaining to 9/11 in the sort of 2007, 2008 period. He had actually been prompted by an individual named Splitting the Sky to study 9/11. So Splitting the Sky is really the reason that Professor Hall and I study 9/11.
John Boncourt is
John Boncourt, yeah. He's our friend. He lives in British Columbia, close to here. Splitting the Sky is the man who tried to arrest George Bush when George Bush came to Calgary, Alberta, Canada on March 17th, 2009. That was Bush's first visit to a foreign country without diplomatic immunity. And in Canada, we have the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act and the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which explicitly render such credibly accused war criminals, now post-memoir, he's a self-confessed war criminal, they're inadmissible to Canada. And so Splitting the Sky tried to arrest Bush.
And they had a $1,500 a plate dinner for him.
Well, indeed, yeah. And actually, Bush is coming to the Vancouver area on October 20th, and Cheney's coming in September, so we're mobilizing in Canada for that. But anyway, that's a segue onto another matter. So 9/11, Splitting the Sky had been studying it. He had encouraged Professor Hall to take a look at it. And therefore, Professor Hall started incorporating that into his curriculum in his globalization studies classes. And so as my university degree began to culminate, I started talking to Professor Hall about the possibility of us doing a thesis-based MA program, studying what we're calling the origins of the global war on terror, intellectual debates and interpretive controversies. Because of course, in Canada, we have a lot of actual academic, professors who are able to, study 9/11. It's slightly more liberal than the US, where you have people like Kevin Barrett losing their jobs and stuff. In Canada, we actually have a few profs who can get away with teaching this, and my professor happens to be one of them. And so we basically submitted all the forms and had our fingers crossed, and it was accepted. And so for the last 2 years, I've been studying the origins of the global war on terror. The quite funny thing is on November 24th, 2010, last year, I opened my email inbox, and lo and behold, I'd been nominated for a very prestigious scholarship called the Queen Elizabeth II Graduate Scholarship. And so the mainstream media in Canada, such as the National Post and Maclean's magazines, very prominent news outlets in Canada, started whipping up a fuss and making a big deal out of the fact that I was getting taxpayers' money to study so-called 9/11 conspiracy theories. So that's where it really became kind of famous in Canada. I'm fairly well known now because the mainstream media have attempted to, get me defunded and oppose me studying the origins of the global war on terror. And of course, they failed in doing so. Interestingly, you may have heard of the new hit piece on the 9/11 truth movement called Among the Truthers by Jonathan Kay. Jonathan Kay is the Canadian-based journalist who's been attacking me, and he attacks me in the book. He's just published a hit piece with a hit piece published by a Rupert Murdoch subsidiary called Among the Truthers, A Journey Through the Conspiracist Underground, in which he tries to compare 9/11 truth with the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Then you look into Jonathan Kay's background. He's only written one other book in his life, and surprise, surprise, that was written with a Mossad agent, a retired Mossad agent called The Canadian Volunteer, about a Canadian who volunteers for the Mossad, which is quite an interesting book. And so he's gone from writing a book with a Mossad agent to attacking the 9/11 truth movement. So I've been able to expose that connection and raise several question marks about his bona fides in that regard. So in my 9/11 studies, basically another addendum to this, of course, is that when I was at my university, when I got into university life, I also was involved heavily in the Palestinian issue and still am. I read thoroughly and voraciously on the subject of the Israel-Palestine impasse, and I helped to found a chapter of the Solidarity for Palestinian Human Rights group that's a pan-Canada phenomenon. And so when I started studying about 9/11, originally I kind of compartmentalized them as the Israel-Palestine conflict and 9/11 as being two separate subjects. But as I got deeper into the subject matter, I began to realize these aren't two separate subjects. And in fact, they're heavily interwoven, and especially when one engages with the scholarship of, for example, Professor Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer, who are at the University of Chicago and Harvard, who have argued quite convincingly that the war on Iraq wasn't actually waged at the behest of oil companies. They ask those who say that the war in Iraq was for oil to prove that oil companies were lobbying and so on for that war. But there's a great deal of evidence that they've marshaled to suggest that the war against Iraq was actually waged at the behest of a Likudnik faction in the state of Israel, who were working with their neoconservative allies, such as Wolfowitz and Feith, both of whom were charged with passing classified documents to the state of Israel in the 1980s, but who managed to burrow their way into the Pentagon and erect a
defense contractors also.
Excuse me, sir?
Defense contractors, right? Also, when you get in there. When you're looking at who's going to benefit.
I think we have to distinguish between those who profited from the wars and those who lobbied for the wars.
Oh, right. Okay, all right.
And, the thing is, with the war on terror, it was obviously a very tight conspiracy, and 9/11 too, done by a handful of people. And so, there are some oil companies who have benefited in the long run. Halliburton, for example, isn't an oil company, it's an oil infrastructure company. And so right here in Alberta, where I am, is where the tar sands are. It's an oil-rich part of the world. If somebody came and smashed up the oil infrastructure here, Halliburton would profit because they rebuild oil infrastructure, and therefore smashing up Iraq was acceptable to Cheney and his comrades in Halliburton. But for oil companies, they like stability for oil markets in the region, in the Middle East. They don't like creating civil war on top of the world's biggest oil field. And actually, James Petrus, Stephen Snigoski, Virginia Tilley, Walt Mearsheimer, a number of scholars have demonstrated that. In fact, there's no evidence that oil companies have really promoted a war policy in the last sort of 15 and 20 years. And in fact, it's really the Zionist tail that's wagging the American dog in terms of Middle East policy. I'm not one of these people who says, Zionists are ruling the world or whatever, but in terms of Middle East policy, I think to divorce an analysis of the Middle East from the all-powerful Israel lobbyists, from the neoconservatives who are people like Wolfowitz and Feith, who established that shadow defense establishment in the Pentagon under the rubric of the Office of Special Plans. It makes one distort one's analysis if they don't incorporate that into it. And then, of course, on 9/11, there's the famous dancing Israelis, and Larry Silverstein used to have a phone call with Benjamin Netanyahu one time per week, according to, once a week he was on the phone to the Israeli Prime Minister.
Well, there was more than just those dancing
There was
Israelis,
three vans, three people, three separate teams that were Mossad teams that were intercepted that day. One by the NYPD, one by East Rutherford, which were the dancing Israelis, and one by the New Jersey State Police, right by the George Washington Bridge. And I personally, I personally know about the one on the George Washington Bridge because, as I've said to listeners, the listeners know, I've said on the show before, I was a first responder. We were in the command center at Giant Stadium, and you heard them talk about it. And they said they were Mossad.
And not to mention, we were in the middle of rounding up the biggest spy ring in the history of the United States, which happened to be an Israeli spy ring. All right, back after the break. Okay, welcome back to the 420 break. This is the Orion Talk Radio Network. During the last hour of Popeye's show, we will get back into the sciences of 9/11. But one of the things that you have to understand about September 11th is the broader picture of the Middle Eastern foreign policy that has blossomed.
The whole geopolitics of the region. It's really important to understand that.
The war on terror could not have happened without it. So we'll go back to why 9/11 couldn't have happened without inside help in a minute and a little later. And from here on, we're going to focus on the policies that we've come to love and ever since. The kill them there before they kill us here. That allows us to prosecute this war on terror. So Josh, when you left off, when I interrupted you before this last break, you were talking about Mossad and Israeli foreknowledge and involvement, and now we'll just pick up from there.
Yeah, well, I think it's obviously correct to situate the 9/11 crimes within the proper historical and political context. And I think that there's a tendency on the left. I consider myself to be left-wing, to be a socialist. And I think there's a tendency to use generalizations like, it's the American empire or it's the military-industrial complex. But if you push people to say, well, can you define for me who were the different factions, who were the political actors who were prosecuting this war on terror and promoting and lobbying for and conspiring to do the war on terror, who were the neoconservatives, what motivated them? A lot of people can't do that. And so what I tried to do was, whilst I was trying to figure out 9/11 and who are Al-Qaeda and do they really exist, and it turns out they kind of don't exist and so on, I also tried to find out, well, who are the neoconservatives? And as I say, I had this background in the Israel-Palestine issue, and it turns out that they're pretty much, many of them are people who are partisan to Israel, who were formerly kind of left-wing individuals who didn't like the way that the Democrat Party or people to the left of that started promoting a kind of more isolationist approach to after the Vietnam War, and even started sympathizing with what might be called third world causes, such as Arab nationalism and the Palestine Liberation Organization and so on. And so you had, obviously a lot of people who are Jewish are traditionally liberal because, when under liberalism you have equality under the law or the rule of law, because Jews didn't do very well in history when you didn't have that. But then they found themselves in this conflict of sort of interest where many Jewish people were sympathetic to Israel, and a lot of the left weren't sympathetic to Israel, especially after 1967. Increasingly, there was a lot of disdain towards the state of Israel, and so you had people like Wolfowitz, Feith, Libby, Ledeen, such people gravitating towards the right. Norman Podhoretz, many individuals, in order to try and promote an interventionist policy in the Middle East, because interventionism would allow the U.S. to be going into the Middle East and smashing up Israel's enemies. Of course, Israel's goal is to attain regional hegemony. If you look at what's been called the Sharon Doctrine, there's a great book by a journalist based in Nazareth, a British guy called Jonathan Cook, called Israel and the Clash of Civilizations, and he goes into the Sharon Doctrine, which was basically to establish an Israeli empire in the Middle East. And of course, Israel doesn't have the same interests as the American empire, no matter how hard such people like the neocons try to pitch Israeli interests as being synonymous with those of the American empire. They're really not, because the US empire, it wants to prop up Arab strongmen who then allow them to despoil and loot their resources in order to create stability in the region. A good example of this is, remember Gulf War #1, where George Bush's dad, who happens to be George Bush Sr., who happens to be the only US president to have ever stood up to the Israel lobby, he went in and secured Kuwait after Saddam destabilized the Middle East by invading Kuwait. And then all the neocons and the Zionists and so on were saying, oh, you have to go and take out Saddam. You have to go and take out Saddam. And he said, why would I do that? I want stability. I'm an oil man. I want stability in the Middle East. And he went back to the US after securing Kuwait. If you look at the primary sources at the time, those who were partisan to the state of Israel were denouncing George Bush Sr. And he also tried to get serious with the Israel-Palestine conflict because, of course, he realized as an oil man he has no interest in alienating and estranging the Arab leaders in the region. The Sharon Doctrine, what you might call the Israelo-centric worldview, is one of trying to destabilize the Middle East, also to break the OPEC cartel, because that allows Saudi Arabia to get strong. That's why on 9/11, blaming 15 Saudis isn't a problem for Israel, because demonizing Saudi Arabia is quite a good thing for Israel. Wolfowitz has actually called for the Saudi dictatorship to be taken out, and I'd say Saudi Arabia is kind of the jewel in the crown in the American empire, right? They've been working collaboratively with the American empire, allowing them to despoil and to devour their resources.
Close allies of the Bushes.
Pardon?
Bin Laden's anyways.
Yeah, well, I largely see a lot of the stuff with the Saudi connections to 9/11 as being red herrings and distracting us from the more egregious confluence of interests that occurred between Israel and those who did 9/11, and Israel was obviously involved in some way in 9/11. And, as I say, if you hear the testimony of Susan Lindau, who was a CIA asset who was going between the Saddam Hussein and the CIA, during the period of sanctions, she said, well, Saddam was begging us to be our stooge again. He promised to buy 1 million cars a year. He said, I'll be your puppet.
Let the FBI have their own office.
Well, because
I interviewed Susan Lindauer multiple times on my show, Josh, and she has talked about the fact that that's why they threw her in jail, and they vilify her, and they'd made her out to try to be a crazy nut and all this other stuff, and then they tried to say she was a traitor. When she was sent over there, she was a CIA asset. She was sent over there, and when she came back, she just brought them news that they didn't want to hear. And then when they went, when they started ringing the war drums, she stood up and had the balls to say something, and she ended up getting locked up for it.
Well, indeed. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. So I think what we need to do is, it's true there is a thing called the global American empire, but within that empire, just like the British Empire, there's factions, right? So in the British Empire, you had this big debate over mercantilism versus free trade, or should we do direct rule and go and occupy a country, or should we do indirect rule? There was a guy in the British Empire called Lord Lugard who was involved in Nigeria saying, why don't we co-opt like local elites, because it looks really bad when you have sort of English guys occupying Nigeria. But why don't we co-opt local compradors? In Spanish, they call it comprador, right? Like a local stooges. And that way it's a better way to run your empire. And that's the way the American empire often has run, right? It's through, like, it has an occupation force in Japan, but it operates its empire through Japanese politicians who are just puppets, right? But it allows the indigenous people of that colony of yours to at least think of themselves as having some legitimate government. And so that's the way the U.S. has traditionally operated in the Middle East. And so clearly it wouldn't be in the vested interest of oil companies of the traditional U.S. empire builders, the kind of people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, to go and, just create civil war and mayhem in the Middle East. That's really good for Israel, because when the Arabs are fighting Arabs, then they're not fighting the Zionist cuckoo in the nest. They're not fighting Israel in the region. They're not unified. And so it's a great policy.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Yeah, and even if you look at the Israeli strategic documents, I can draw your attention to one by an individual named Oded Yinon, he was a strategic analyst in Israel who wrote a paper called The Strategy for Israel in the 1980s. And they invoke the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire ruled the Middle East through something called the millet system. a millet is like a confessional group or an ethnic or religious group. And so I'm just getting a message. An ethnic or religious group, and so they're citing the Ottoman Empire, the way that they broke down the Middle East, destabilized the Middle East into little kind of ethnic bantustans in order to allow Israel to be the kind of like the strongman in the region. And so their goal is to take out all the Arab strongmen. And lo and behold, we're seeing Gaddafi taken out, and Libya is going to be carved up like a shawarma into different polities and weakened.
Yeah, with a system of usury in place.
Indeed. So
it's important to note that Libya was one of the only countries left on this planet that didn't have a Rothschild Zionist central banking system in place until the quote-unquote rebels took over, and the first two things they made were an oil company and a central bank.
Exactly. I mean, that's the thing. I think we're coming to a break.
Stand by for the break, guys. We'll be back after this break with Josh, with Popeye from Federal Jack. We finish discussing Middle East policy. It's Ryan Talk Radio Network. And welcome back. All right, Josh, let me ask you, who benefits the most from, because certainly here in America, we're not benefiting at all, really, from the war in Iraq. So who does benefit from the war in Iraq?
Well, I'm not one to disparage, the working class in any country, so I don't want to disparage the Israeli people, but certainly the Israeli elite, the Likud party in Israel, the Israeli right, the various coalitions on the right wing of Israel, and, it must be said, Jewish American elites who've safely ensconced in Miami and, California and the Hamptons and Brooklyn, want to send Israeli working class kids, American working class kids, to kill and be killed at their behest in order to allow the state of Israel to attain 100 years of hegemony based on 100 years war against Islam. That seems to be what's happening. I was trying to illustrate in what I was saying to you earlier that within every empire there are factions who have different philosophies and different ways they conceive of ruling the empire. And it's quite evident in the American empire, there's two factions. And one is the kind of one personified by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who says, why do we want to bomb Iran? We should use Iran, who's Shia, against the Sunni nations in order to create stability. So, for example, Iran, after 9/11, was offering to fight the Sunni Taliban in Afghanistan. And yet you have then the neocon Zionist sort of interventionist faction. These are the people who brought us Iran-Contra. Remember, at that time, the oil men were supporting Saddam against Iran, because
right.
After the Shah was overthrown, we saw the U.S. shift from supporting Iran to supporting Iraq, because Iran was getting strong. And of course, usually the traditionally sort of economically motivated empire builders, they want stability. It's like Brzezinski's chessboard, right? They want to play people off against each other in order to create stability. The neocon Zionist faction, they want to drop a bomb on every problem. They want to destabilize, especially the Middle East, in order to allow Israel to be the top dog in the region. And they don't mind if that alienates and ruins the profits of oil companies, if it ruins the jewel in the crown, the Saudi relationship with the United States. I mean, take, for example, Gaddafi. Gaddafi, there's images of him hugging Tony Blair in a tent in the desert. He had sold out eventually to the British and American oil and gas companies. And yet he's been taken out now. Why is this? It clearly is because when you have such leaders allowing their resources to be developed by foreign, companies, there's certainly bad things that go on. They suppress their own people and so on. But invariably, some of those profits are reaped for the Arab people, and that eventually leads to prosperity and so on for
stability.
The Arab, and for those leaders. And the U.S. invariably exchanges those resources for weapons. And so take, for example, in 1991, Saddam fired 31 Scud missiles at Tel Aviv. I visited Israel in my teens on a family holiday, and there's statues and monuments throughout Tel Aviv to the people who died when Saddam fired these Scud missiles at Israel. And so that's a good illustration of how when you prop up these Arab strongmen, it's all right for oil and gas companies safely ensconced in Texas and Houston, because they just care about their profits. But for Israel, who's in the region, they can't tolerate Arab strongmen emerging. And so the Sharon Doctrine, which was basically the Israeli version of what you might call the Wolfowitz Doctrine in the U.S., was about trying to take out and reconfigure the Middle East, do this grand strategy of reconfiguring and basically reducing the Middle East into small statelets. Now, that's not to say that there weren't some motivations for the resources, like once they'd reduced Iraq into small statelets, a Shia state and a Sunni state and a Kurdish state and so on, then pillaging the resources, but often it's going to be done by a new class of oil-producing companies or oil companies.
Well, they let the mega corporations come in there and just have their way with the people. They turn you know what I'm saying? It's like a plaything. They let the huge, the big ones, you know, the Monsantos, the Carlyles, just get to go in there and have their way with everything and everybody unaccountably.
Yeah, but I think we have to distinguish between those who profited sort of post-bellum after the war and those who lobbied and conspired and plotted to do 9/11 and the 9/11 wars. And so we can talk about oil companies and all the other people who went in to rebuild countries. There's a whole industry there, right? But I think when it comes to those who plotted and conspired for 9/11 and the 9/11 wars, we're really looking at a very small group of individuals. A lot of them were intermarried and very, very tight-knit group of people. I'm talking about, you know, less than 1% of the
neocons, Zionists, dual citizens.
Exactly, and so that's really where I situate the 9/11 incident in that context. And I do find that in the 9/11 truth movement, when there is this failure to deal with the Israeli aspect of 9/11, that people's analyses become quite warped and quite distorted. And you know, I think they
have to account for things.
Yeah, and I'm of the belief, you know, that if we don't have the truth, we can't have justice. If we don't have the truth, we can't really resist these wars because we're going to be misguided in our analysis. And so I do think that what I'm trying to bring in the 9/11 truth movement, obviously I've as part of my MA thesis, I'm doing more conservative stuff, like going into the minutiae of how the towers came down and, you know, the more scientific stuff and more uncontroversial details of the events of 9/11. But when it comes to the political context, I think it's really important to recognize that this was largely an Israeli-inspired initiative. Professor Fetzer was very over the moon to hear that I just discovered this book. I Googled Benjamin Netanyahu on Amazon, actually, to discover what books he'd written. I thought that'd be an interesting research project. So I ordered this one book called Terrorism, How the West Can Win, authored in 1986. And I don't know if you guys have ever checked out Nafiz Ahmed's book, one of the early 9/11 Truth books, The War on Truth. And he begins his book with something called the Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism, which was in 1979 in Jerusalem, hosted by the Jonathan Institute, which is named after Jonathan Netanyahu, Benjamin's brother, who died in the raid on Entebbe. And basically, they were pitching the idea that people, you know, they got people like oil men like George Bush Sr., people who weren't really convinced by the Israeli perspective. They brought them into Jerusalem for this conference, and it was basically pitching an idea of having a global war on terrorism, like in 1979. And it turns out that didn't really wash with a lot of the, you know, traditional Anglo-American empire builders who didn't really want to just do this kind of Israeli-inspired war on terror. So then they had another meeting in June 1984 over in Washington, where they obviously could couple themselves with their very powerful and ruthless elite friends in the state, in the United States, and did another conference hosted by the Jonathan Institute, where they're trying to pitch this idea in the 80s of having a global war on something called international terrorism, right? So whereas it's true Israel does have like a small problem with terrorism, largely it's either caused by itself or it's false flag terrorism by its own government, but to try and then take what's going on in Palestine and globalize that, Professor James Petrus has used the phrase, the globalization of Zionist power. You know, try and make Israel's worldview the worldview of people in England and Canada and the United States. That was really the initiative. And so this book that I've acquired called Terrorism, How the West Can Win, I'm saying it's almost like Benjamin Netanyahu's equivalent of Mein Kampf, or maybe a manifesto for the global war on terror. And it's really quite astonishing when you're reading a book this book came out in 1986, the year I was born, and you're reading, you know, about this war on terrorism and all the language that that resonated after 2001, but yet this is in 1986 that they're using such language, and it really does indicate that the intellectual work, you know, the people that we would be putting in the kind of Nuremberg type docs, the people who weren't the lower down people implementing the genocidal policies, but those at the top who are doing the intellectual work. You know, at Nuremberg there was a guy named Hans Friedrich. He'd never picked up a gun, but he'd created an intellectual environment to dehumanize certain populations, allowing genocide to occur. So like these type of people who are doing the brain work for the war on terror, it seems to be largely those involved in the state of Israel, either politicians like Benjamin Netanyahu or other individuals. This book that I'm talking about is actually got a collection of essays in it from various analysts who are trying to promote, you know, this globalization of the kind of Israel worldview. And really the events of 9/11 and 7/7 in England have facilitated that. Now British people fear Israel's enemies. That's been the function served by these false flag terrorist attacks. I recently accessed FBI statistics, which indicate that between 1980 and 2005, of all the terrorist attacks done against United States people, 6% were done by Muslims, 7% were done by Jews, 24% were done by so-called left-wing extremist groups, about 42% were done by Hispanic or Latino terrorists. And so Islamic terrorism is a quite negligible phenomenon when situated within the other statistics on ethnic and religious groups engaging in terrorism. Professor Kevin Barrett's indicated in his book that based on US statistics, you're more likely to die in the bath and more likely to die from lightning than from terrorism. Yet we're not having a war on bathtubs, but we are having a war on, let's be honest, it's on Islam. Really,
on Middle Eastern terror.
Yeah, and so it's largely
heart disease as well is the same thing. More Americans die each year of heart disease than they do of terrorism anywhere in the world. But I don't see the SWAT teams jumping in and trying to stop McDonald's from serving crappy food.
No. All right, stand by, guys. Hold that thought. Hold that thought right there. We'll be back after this break. This is the Orion Talk Radio Network. All right, welcome back to the show. Welcome back to Against the Wall. Before the break, we were talking about how the war or Middle Eastern Islamic terror is largely fabricated. It's not nearly, the world problem that, for Americans at least, that we're led to believe. And we know who controls our media. And so it goes hand in hand that the wool's being pulled over our eyes again over what Islamic terror really means to the United States. So we'll pick up right from there, where we're.
Yeah, well, part of my MA studies, I was recently, submitting a formal administrative document, and I was trying to define my thesis, and my professor, my MA supervisor, was saying, Josh, don't just take what we call the official story of 9/11 for granted. You should define that and try and write like a history of how the official story evolved. And when you stop to contemplate that, you begin to realize it's largely a media operation, like inventing the official story of 9/11. It was largely done through the media.
Yeah.
This concept of like Al-Qaeda existing and showing us videos of bearded Islamists and so on. And of course, we know that the alleged hijackers on 9/11 weren't Islamists because a number of them were seen eating pork, drinking vodka, snorting cocaine, hiring prostitutes, going to strip clubs and so on. And as Wayne Madsen, who's a journalist, a very reliable, credible source, he claims to have received British intelligence documents, which were sort of telling the British government or warning the British government that actually these alleged hijackers on 9/11 were all Mossad penetrated and controlled. Mohammed Atta's girlfriend said he spoke Hebrew fluently. And so it seems that, this has been what you might call a blood libel against Islamic people. And I think Kevin Barrett is going to be on your show today, if I'm not mistaken. And he can talk a lot more about this from an Islamic perspective because, this has been an unprecedented lie that has been propagated. And this is all done, of course, as I was saying, to try and make Israel's enemies, because Israel actually genuinely does have some Islamic people who, largely the 1 billion people who are Islamic don't really recognize the need for a Jewish state for the Jewish people in the Middle East. I mean, if you're going to do that, you have to go and find every tribe in Congo that's had genocide done against them and make a state for them. I mean, I don't know that if atoning for past crimes is necessarily the solution is to create an ethnic nationalist state in the middle of a hostile area of the world. And so the thing is, when your goal is to erect an empire premised on divide and rule and encouraging civil war and ethnic and religious sectarianism, false flag terrorism is a wonderful mechanism for implementing that geopolitical strategy. So take, for example, in Egypt, during the recent uprisings in Egypt, there were bombs going off in the Coptic churches, and even the Egyptian Lawyers Guild, like the kind of union for the Egyptian lawyers, were alleging that was a Mossad operation. So part of the Israeli strategic documents that I read from the 80s and 90s, like the Clean Break document and the Oded Yinon's paper, which are two key primary sources on this subject, they talk about carving a Coptic state out of Egypt. They often refer to the success they had in Lebanon of factionalizing Lebanon, the phrase the Lebanonization of the world. The Lebanization of the Middle East is a good phrase. That using the model they used in Lebanon, which they've now applied to Iraq, which is now being applied to Libya, of carving up the Middle East into ethnic and religious statelets. A good way to foment such factionalism among different ethnic and religious groups, because the Middle East is very vociferous and prone to factionalism, is to let off bombs in strategic locations. And you let off a bomb in a Shia area, then they're going to do retribution against the Sunnis and so on and so forth. And that way, the Arabs are fighting Arabs rather than fighting the hegemon in the region. And so that seems to be what's happening. And so obviously, if you're the traditional U.S. empire builders premised on, like most empires, global empires, they want to develop the mother country, or they want to, take resources from the colonies and bring it back to allow Americans to have a high standard of living. I mean, I think another good example.
They want stability.
Yeah, well, I think another good example that I use that perhaps your listeners won't like, because I'm obviously not American and not really a patriotic American. I think a good analogy is the secession of your founding fathers from the British Empire with what the Zionists are doing now. Now, at an ideological level, the founding fathers and the Zionists, they did have this kind of manifest destiny. I mean, if you were a Native American to the west of the Ohio Valley and you had these kind of settlers coming west, it's very similar to what the Palestinians experienced, like the settlers in the West Bank thinking they're kind of like God's chosen people. And so you had like the global empire. And, in like 1763, Sir William Johnson had written this, had allowed King George to declare the Royal Proclamation of 1763, in which he declared that no Indian lands could be taken by white settlers in the 13 colonies without the consent of the Indians. And if you actually read your Declaration of Independence, there's a kind of diatribe against King George III, right? And when you get down, they say that he has brought on the merciless Indian savages whose known means of warfare is the undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. And so right away, you're seeing like the war on terror. In this case, the terrorists are like the Indians, right, being defined in your founding manifesto. And so you see, like, you had a global empire, the British Empire, who was saying, well, we're mercantilist. We want to develop the mother country, right? We just want to work with the Indians in the fur trade and so on. They're kind of like our loyal allies, and then bring the resources from the Americas into the mother country. Likewise with the American empire, people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, they say, well, we need to have a global stability. And you've seen these kind of new elite emerge, just like your founding fathers emerged in the colonies, and likewise in Latin America, like Simon Bolivar, or in South Africa with the white South African nationalists who thought they were kind of God's chosen people too. They don't like getting told what to do from the metropolis. In the case of the British Empire, you get like white elites in South Africa. You read like Nelson Mandela's autobiography, and he talks about he actually had like some legal rights in the British Empire. He could be a lawyer and stuff. And you get these white elites in the colonies who don't like getting treated the same as the natives, right? And so I think it's quite, analogous with the American empire, where they're trying to, the people like George Bush Sr. are trying to balance like multiple vested interests. American empire builders are trying to balance the interests of the Arab elites, interests of Israeli elites, and they're treating the Arabs on like an equal playing field or whatever as the Israelis, and they don't like that. And so what we've seen is just as the 13 colonies seceded from the British Empire and kind of went on their own way of going, just going west and transforming all the Indian lands into private property, into their orbit and into their purview, and creating an American empire on the Indian territories to the west of the 13 colonies. Likewise, we're going to see the Israelis now are seceding from the American empire, and they say, we're going to take care of the Middle East. Thank you very mumuch, American empire. We're not going to get told by Washington what to do. In fact, we're going to tell Washington what to do in the Middle East. It's an unprecedented situation. It's almost like, imagine if like New Zealand had told London what to do in the British Empire. It would have been quite odd. But yet, in terms of Middle East policy, that's exactly what's happening with Israel. And so that's the sort of where I see it. It's a matter of empire building. And so when people say it's anti-Semitic or whatever, I mean, that's rubbish, because I'm talking about, the patterns of empire building that have historically happened. And as I say, it was the same. Yeah, like, Simon Bolivar in Latin America, he didn't like the Peninsulares coming from Spain to tell the white elites in Latin America what to do, and, talking to the Indians and treating blacks, Indians, and whites as different interests, right? The whites wanted to just do what they wanted to do their own initiatives in the colonies, and that's what's happening in Israel. If you read the Clean Break document that was authored by people like Richard Pearl and Meredith Wormser and Douglas Feith and so on, as an advisory for Netanyahu, the Clean Break document, they talk about, we should have like a clean break. I mean, that almost sounds like what the founding fathers did in the States. Like, we want a clean break from the imposition of the empire who's constraining us. And that's really what I think 9/11 did. 9/11 allowed Israel to hoodwink America into fighting its battles for it, because it doesn't have a big population like the US. And that's really not been in the interest of the United States. Wouldn't it have been good for the United States if Saddam Hussein had been buying 1 million cars a year that would have benefited not only the elite, but actually the American people, because it would have helped to revive the economy.
And selling us oil cheaper.
And selling oil cheaper. So I'm not saying that it would have been perfect for the Iraqi people to have a dictator again, or perfect for the American people to continue with this oligarchical system. But I think we have to have a continuum.
There'd be 1 million Iraqis still alive, and there'd be 4 million less displaced Iraqis, and they'd still have an infrastructure.
Well, indeed, and I think that's exactly right. And I think what happens on the left, there's this kind of postmodern nihilism where they think that anything's better than the status quo, and so you have these uprisings, the so-called Arab Springs. And I think that people think, oh, great, they're ousting dictators. That means it's going to be better now. We're going to have democracy in the Middle East. But I don't think that's true. I think that if you have like someone like Mubarak in Egypt who's a tyrant and so on, but the trains run on time, people have jobs, the tourist industry's running, and then you have these uprisings sponsored by Mossad-infiltrated ethnic groups and ethnic factions, and the result ends up being millions of Egyptians are dead because Israel's blowing off a bomb in the Coptic church, so the Coptic seek retribution against the other ethnic groups in the region, and we end up having civil war in Egypt as opposed to some stability as formed through the Mubarak-type people, then obviously that's a worse situation. I'm a socialist. I want economic democracy for all the workers of the world. I believe there's no justification for capital to be pilfered by elites who don't work to produce that capital. I believe in full economic, political, and legal equality under the law, but equality for people. I think that's the fulfillment of the Enlightenment project, is liberté, égalité, fraternité for the economy, not just for politics and law. But, obviously, if the solution, if the cure is worse than the disease, if the cure doesn't cure the disease, doesn't cure the malady, but actually compounds it and makes it more pronounced, that's no solution. That's just civil war and mayhem.
Well said, Josh. Thank you for coming on the show. We're coming up to a break. Guys, this is the end of JJ's show, but we're just going to carry this over to my show, Down the Rabbit Hole. So for all the listeners in the chat, just go to my chat. Everybody listening on the stream, just stay tuned. We'll be back in a few minutes.
Yep. Okay. End of the show. Hope you guys will join me Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. And I'll see you after the break.
And we can stay here, get the shit kicked out of us, or we can fight our way back into the light. We can climb out of hell, 1 inch at a time. You know, when you get old in life, things get taken from you. I mean, that's part of life. But you only learn that when you start losing stuff. You find out life's this game of inches. So is football. Because in either game, life or football, the margin for error is so small. I mean, 1/2 a step too late or too early, and you don't quite make it. 1/2 second too slow, too fast, you don't quite catch it. The inches we need are everywhere around us. They're in every break of the game, every minute, every second. On this team, we fight for that inch. On this team, we tear ourselves and everyone else around us to pieces for that inch. We claw our fingernails for that inch. Because we know when we add up all those inches, that's going to make the fucking difference between winning and losing. It's the guy who's willing to die who's going to win that inch. And I know if I'm going to have any life anymore, it's because I'm still willing to fight and die for that inch. Because that's what living is. There's 6 inches in front of your face. Now, I can't make you do it. You got to look at the guy next to you. Look into his eyes. Now, I think you're going to see a guy who will go that inch with you. You're going to see a guy who will sacrifice himself for this team because he knows when it comes down to it, you're going to do the same for him. That's the team, gentlemen. And either we heal now as a team, or we will die as individuals.
Ideas are bulletproof.
Yes, they are. And no army can stop an idea whose time has come. And the idea whose time has come is truth, no matter how ugly it is. It's very hard for people to deal with things that they don't like. But just like an infection or a cancerous tumor, you have to accept it and learn that there are certain ways to deal with it correctly and certain ways not to deal with it. And in this case, the cancer would be, you could call it the New World Order because there's so many different factions involved in it, but it's taking over the world and turning it into a tyrannical prison planet. That is not a place that I want to live or ever raise children in. Welcome to the show, guys. It is Sunday, September 4th, 2011. This is Down the Rabbit Hole. I'm your host, Popeye from FederalJack.com. Today I'm joined by my buddy JJink and our guest from JJ's show. We carry Joshua over because he's just so filled with information. 1 hour is not enough with him. So he graciously decided to hang on for another at least hour or so. Joshua Blakeney. And if you guys weren't listening, don't worry. The whole entire 4-hour show will be up on YouTube and probably by tonight or tomorrow, so you'll be able to go back and listen to it, or you can listen to JJ's archives from today and then listen to my archives from today on the network, and you'll be able to listen to the whole 4-hour show. Anyway, Joshua, for the last hour, talked a lot about the geopolitics behind 9/11, like with Israel and the Middle East, and it's important that people understand what really went on and what led up to 9/11. Now, the stuff that happened after the fact is a separate issue, which I agree. It needs to be covered, but it's important when you're discussing one specific piece to not cover 85 different, pieces of it or whatever, try to throw everything in at once because it confuses people. So it's important to make a distinction between before and after. Dick Cheney and them obviously had insider knowledge because they're neocons. Paul Wolfowitz and all them, again, they're beholden to their masters. Okay,
Larry
so
Silverstein.
Well, yeah, Silverstein. He obviously
He knew.
Well, he had prior knowledge.
There were a lot of people that knew that something was going to happen.
JJ, he had prior knowledge, and all I'll say about the Sears Tower is if people live anywhere near that thing, you should move away because Rahm Emanuel's the mayor of Chicago, and you have a perfect setup again. You got a mafia-affiliated mayor. You got Larry Silverstein owning the building. I mean, this is starting to add up to
another
the same
old
thing.
Building with huge maintenance costs.
And they're painting it gray, by the way. And if you remember, when it comes to talking about how they could have put the thermite in, Stephen Jones talked about how they could put it in using gray paint. It would have been like gray paint. Yes. So there's one theory, and they're painting it gray. So are they putting thermite on the building? There's a lot of construction going on inside the tower. It's called the Willis Tower now. Are they planting anything in there? Are they putting things in the basement? I mean,
no.
Look, we don't know. I'm not trying to scare anybody. I'm just saying.
Are there any Israeli security firms there? Or
probably. Rahm Emanuel is the mayor of Chicago.
Probably lousy with Israeli telecommunications and.
Well, Rahm Emanuel is the mayor of Chicago, so you have an Israeli insider already inside Chicago. He's a
Israeli telecommunications companies pretty much route almost every landline phone call in the
not pretty
world.
much, they do. Every landline.
Mossad is the most highly, it has the most infiltration into the most groups of any other intelligence agency. They, just before 9/11, Popeye, you'll recall, we were in the process of rounding up the biggest spy ring ever uncovered in the history of America, and we had already arrested up to I think 60 or so Israelis, and there were close to 160 more on the list, and nobody ever talks about that ever either. So what are they doing spying on us? And so we know when you're talking about knowledge of anything going on anywhere in the world, Mossad has somebody there. They've infiltrated every intelligence agency, almost every radical group, every government in the world. Somehow, some fashion, right?
Yeah. I think that's correct. Can I chime in?
Yeah, go ahead. Interject. What do you think?
Well, I was even looking into the assassination of Aldo Moro, the Italian president, who was, of course, allowing the Communist Party in Italy, the left, the anti-imperialist left, to be incorporated into the Italian parliament. And indeed, it would seem that Mossad were even involved in that assassination because, of course, they didn't want a Mediterranean country to start to become more anti-imperialist because Israel is an imperialist entity or a colonial entity. And invariably, when countries start to swing towards the left in politics, they start sympathizing with the plight of the Palestinians and the broader Arab body politic in the Arab world because they've been the victims of imperialism. And so even I'm just going to attend the Toronto hearings in Toronto next week, which are some sort of quasi-judicial type hearings that we're having involving 9/11, and there's going to be evidence presented, and lawyers and judges are going to appraise the evidence. And one of the judges is the former head of the Supreme Court of Italy, who's coming into Toronto to hear the testimony of witnesses and 9/11 skeptics in the academic community. And he came out and made statements that it's quite evident that the Red Brigades, who are seemingly a left-wing group, were infiltrated by Mossad, and they're the people who executed the Italian president. And so it's not just Islamist groups that have been infiltrated, it's even sort of left-wing groups or people in the Cold War who portrayed themselves as secular and so on.
Look at the ADL and look at the Southern Poverty Law Center here. Southern Poverty Law Center, big time. They're heavily connected to the Oklahoma City bombing. They run Elohim City, and I found it very ironic that there was. They tried to in the beginning attach a quote unquote Muslim presence to that, and then it went off onto the lone nut American militia type stuff. But at first, that's why they never talked about John Doe number 2. After they researched it, the news media covered it for a couple of days, and then John Doe number 2 disappeared.
Yeah, because he was going to be the Arab connection, I'm sure.
Well, that's what they were leaning to. They were leaning towards John Doe number 2 was the Arab connection. But when you actually research it, there's Mossad ties to the Oklahoma City bombing as well.
Because of Elohim City.
Well, from an academic perspective, because your listeners might not know, I'm doing my MA thesis on 9/11 from a 9/11 truth perspective. Is obviously with this 10th anniversary going on, there's a lot of interesting publications coming out and documents. Obviously, like I mentioned, that I've been getting attacked by the journalist Jonathan Kay.
It's hit piece after hit piece coming out all of a sudden, like out of nowhere. As soon as the anniversary comes up, everything is 9/11 truthers are crazy if you don't believe, And then it also segues into if you talk about Zionism or Israel or anything else, now you're just a friggin' Nazi and you're an anti-Semite, which is complete horse crap. We're going to break, guys. Stand by. Listeners, stay tuned. We'll be right back in about 3 minutes. Welcome back to the show, guys. It is September 4th, 2011. This is the Sunday edition of Down the Rabbit Hole. I'm your host, Popeye from FederalJack.com. I am joined by my good friend JJink and our special guest, Joshua Blakeney. Josh, during the break, we were heavily discussing pretty much geopolitics and how Israel has their fingers through Mossad in every little thing. It's important for a lot of people to understand that Israel, when we talk about Israel, we don't mean the citizens. We mean the government that controls.
They're just the ones that get to die.
It's like the country of the United States. The citizens don't really run their country either.
No, we just get to die.
Israel has a street called Rothschild Boulevard. Do I need to say any more about who runs the show over there? And if you understand anything about the Rothschild family, and that most people understand that the Rothschilds are part of the New World Order, they're a major part of it. Their spawn, the Rockefellers. Okay, the Rockefellers really should be called the Rothschilds. They're just a little offspring of that. And Bill Clinton,
Rothschild Jr.
Rockefellers, yes. Bill Clinton is a Rockefeller. He's a Rockefeller. Go check it out. But yes, they all come from the Rothschild clan. And who controlled British intelligence during World War II? Lord Rothschild. Who worked, as a caveat, who worked for British intelligence under Lord Rothschild? He worked for OSS, but worked with British intelligence and Lord Rothschild during World War II. And was later found out to be a CIA agent after he was admitted by Jesse Helms to be a CIA agent only after he had died. a man by the name of Clay Shaw, who is connected to none other than the John F. Kennedy assassination.
Right.
So you see how it all spiderwebs into each other? Okay. And yes, I'm not saying that when you say Mossad or Israel, it's not the Jews did it, the Jews did it. See, that kind of crap, that's actually disinfo that's fomented by agents of Mossad that work through people like the ADL or the SPLC to say, oh, you see, this guy says all the Jews did it, and then they fire up the idiot skinheads who are there are racist morons out there, and they will be like, screw the Jews. So then they get all fired up and they start ranting off and saying stupid crap.
Can I say screw some Jews?
Well, no, it's not. First of all,
I'm just kidding. I'm just joking.
It should be that if you want to get mad,
it's too serious.
You should say, Zionism.
Screw Zionism.
Well, the thing is, Zionism needs anti-Semitism, right? Because without anti-Semitism, there's no justification for a Jewish state.
Exactly, because then there's no threat from the outside to the in.
And this is the vicious cycle of the war on terror, because the more false flag terrorist attacks Israel does, the more audacious they act, the more chutzpah they display, the more people like us, who are just normal people who can read and discern and distinguish between fact and fiction, will become angry at Israel and estranged with Israel and alienated with the U.S. support for Israel. And then they can twist that through mechanisms, through institutions like the ADL, and call that, anti-Zionist sentiment anti-Semitic. And so they actually have a win-win situation, because the more audacious they act, not only do they get political capital from demonizing Muslims, they also alienate normal citizens of the world in Britain and Canada and the US. And then they can say, oh, look, all you Jews, all the people in Britain and Canada and the US hate you, right? But really, so we're just trying to criticize the politicians in Israel. And even, as you suggested, a lot of Israelis actually, I've seen stuff in the Israeli peace movement, people talking and saying they really feel their politicians are puppets of US Jewish elites, And so people like Benjamin Netanyahu, they're not really their own men, but they're actually working at the behest of, people like Wolfowitz and Feith. And it's often the case, when you have people who convert to a religion, it's like the people who've converted are a bit more like fundamentalist than those who are actually part of it. And it's almost like a lot of American Jews are more Israeli than the Israelis themselves. And they become, that's what I think we saw with the neoconservatives. It was sort of individuals who were born in the United States, grew up in the United States, but who are often are Jewish and who are very sympathetic to Israel. And they almost are more sort of fundamentalist Zionists than the actual Zionists themselves or the actual Israelis themselves, And
right.
And
well,
so I think that's part of it. Also the concept, that Jewish elites being willing to kill working class Jews. I mean, I told you, I am a Marxist, and I do view the world through kind of a class paradigm, that you have like the ruling class who are ruthless and willing to do whatever they want to the working class. And so James Fetzer can talk more about how he's done work with an individual in Argentina, exposing 2 false flag terrorist attacks in Argentina. One was against the Israeli embassy, which killed Israeli citizens, and one was against the Jewish Cultural Center and seemed to have been Israeli false flag attacks. Likewise, in World War II, if you look at Lenny Brenner's work on Zionist-Nazi collaborations, all the communist Jews and all the working class Jews who are assimilationists, who wanted to overcome ethnic and religious parochialism, were fighting the Nazis and getting sent to the concentration camps. A handful of Zionists conspired with the Nazis to get their money and their rich friends out of Germany into Palestine. And so, yet again, there was, if you read the primary sources by Eichmann, he talks about all these deals he was doing with the guy named Kastner, who was a Zionist leader in Hungary, and that Zionist leader helped them round up Jews at the train station in Budapest, while he was doing it in exchange for him and a few of his friends getting out to Palestine. And so you see throughout history, likewise, I mean, these
Kissinger did that, Henry Kissinger did that. Yeah. A lot of people think that he's some great, awesome individual. No, far from it. He helped the Nazis round up Jews.
Yeah.
He pointed them out.
Actually, Kissinger, though, he's an interesting character, Kissinger, because I think it's confusing when people, brand him tar him with the same brush as like the Netanyahu and that, because even
he's much different. He's a weird character, dude, when you check him out, because just some of the stuff he does doesn't follow with what these other people like Ehud Barak or Netanyahu or Ariel Sharon believe.
Well, I think we have to be careful that because Henry Kissinger's Jewish, I don't think he actually really supports the Israeli line. I think he's with that camp that's the traditional American empire builders. a good indication of this is look at the people who attack him, like people like Christopher Hitchens, who are ardent neocons, ardent Zionists with the war on terror. Of all the people you can write a book about and argue he's a genocidaire and a war criminal, he did it on Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger is one of those who's been arguing that the war on terror is actually more for Israel than oil. And so I think even though Henry Kissinger happens to be Jewish, I think we shouldn't just assume he's, pro-Israel in the sense of building the Israeli empire in the Middle East. I think he's really with he went and did international relations studies and so on. He's an international relations scholar, right? And a historian. And I think that he realizes, he views things more through like the paradigm of American empire than through the kind of attempts to secede certain Zionist elites in the Middle East. So I think that sometimes we get confused with just because Kissinger happens to, be Jewish, that he's on side with the Israeli agenda. I don't necessarily think he is, to be honest.
No, I mean, he's a war criminal in his own right, but it's just amazing how, again, there's a dichotomy between, most people, that's a big thing. A lot of people always say, well, if he's a Jew, he's a Jew, which is stupid because I'm Jewish. I'm from Jewish heritage, I guess you could say. My grandmother was a Jew. My mother was a Jewish woman, and under, according to Jewish law and Jewish rights, whatever you want to call it, I'm a Jewish male because I was born to a Jewish woman, so I have Jewish blood in me. I'm not a practicing Jew by any means. I was raised actually Protestant. And I don't go to church or any of that crap. I don't believe in any religion anymore because I think organized religion is used to control people, and I think the true meaning of stuff is hidden from us. Anyway, I have a big issue myself with how they use what really happened, because my grandmother was persecuted. I had family members that were rounded up. I mean, she had her face beat in because she refused to witness an execution, and they shot the guy next to her anyway. It didn't matter, but she refused to open her eyes and watch it, so they beat her face in with an MP40 machine gun. So, and she had scars the rest of her life. She became an alcoholic because of the, the stress and the, what she went through and the trauma and everything. But the fact that these people now, these Zionist pricks, use what my family and others really did go through, and they distort it and everything to cry, oh, poor me, and then justify doing the exact same thing to innocent people elsewhere in the world is just completely unacceptable, and I refuse to stand for it. So,
yeah, it's an exploitation of the memory of those who suffered in World War II.
Exactly. 110% exploitation. We're going to break. We'll be right back. We're back from break. And during the break, I was having a very interesting conversation with Joshua. And I had asked him what his take on Rahm Emanuel being in the White House and the Zionist influence in the White House and what it would be now that Emanuel had left. And it ended up dovetailing into a conversation about the bombing of the King David Hotel because, for the listeners that don't know, Rahm Emanuel's father was an ear gun terrorist who were responsible for bombing the King David Hotel, and they blamed it on Arabs. And they killed Arabs, Jews, at the time it was Palestinians, Jews, and British citizens. And I think there were a couple American citizens that were killed as well. Anyway, they admitted later on proudly, there's a BBC video about it. I have it up on one of my YouTube channels. I think it's Federal JackTube 6. And they admit that they just, they went in there and did this, and they did it on purpose, and they were proud they did it. They were trying to create a Palestinian state. And when you think about why this push, somebody had to back these guys financially. Obviously, if you have this terrorist, the Irgun terrorist organizations, you have to look at who was backing them. Of course, they were backed by the Rothschilds. Rothschilds already had intelligence experience. The intelligence agencies actually stemmed from these rich families with their own intelligence networks to find out where everything was going on. That's where the CIA comes from. That's where OSS, Mossad, MI6, that's where all this comes from. All these intel agencies don't work for the government of the people. The CIA actually doesn't work for the government. It's a separate corporation that works. That has its own little rules and everything else. People need to really see what the hell is going on. Anyway, I was talking to Joshua, and I said he brought up a really good point as to why the Rothschilds and these uber-rich elitist I don't even want to call them Jews. We'll call them fake Jews. These evil Zionist pricks didn't want the working class average Jew, no matter where they were from, Czechoslovakia, Poland. They didn't want them to, filter over to America. And Josh was telling me some really, really superb info. So, Josh, go ahead and tell the listeners what you were telling me about how this was literally more class warfare.
Yeah. Well, of course, there was always this central contradiction in Zionism, if I could provide some historical context. Zionism emerged at the end of the 19th century in order to solve two problems. One was Gentile attraction, so they wanted to stop Jews becoming attracted to the host society that they lived in and just losing their Jewish identities, their ethnic or religious or cultural identities, and seeing themselves just as Brits or as Germans or as Italians. They wanted them to preserve their Jewish nationalist identity. And there was also the fear that Zionism tried to solve, or the problem Zionism tried to solve, of Gentile rejection or anti-Semitism, the physical or sometimes legal imposition, discrimination against Jewish people. And so within Zionism, there was obviously factions. And so you've referred to Rahm Emanuel's father, and he was part of the revisionist current of Zionism. Within political Zionism, there was a schism. And so the hard right, who were kind of founded by Vladimir Jabotinsky, they took an approach that they should be against the British, right? Because the British wanted to basically put the Jews against the Arabs in a kind of divide and rule way. And the Labour Zionists were trying to cozy up towards the British and be more pragmatic. And so the reason you saw them executing British military individuals and blowing up the King David Hotel on the right wing, on the revisionist side, as exemplified in the terrorist gangs like the Irgun and the Stern gang, was because they were against the British attempts to reduce the potential Jewish state that they were going to help to create, to not include Transjordan and basically what we're now seeing like the Greater Israel that people like Netanyahu and that are helping to establish. But the point, going back to what you asked me about, was that there's class relations involved in Zionism, and you had assimilated Jews, so who had basically become British citizens or American citizens, who feared an influx of working class sort of peasants from the shtetl, like working class sort of diminutive Jewish working class people, into Brooklyn and London and places where they had quite elitist and comfortable and cushy lives. They probably feared anti-Semitism, so it's not all the fault of them. There was always been some threat of anti-Semitism posed by Gentiles, for sure. But they basically supported Zionism as a solution to the Jewish problem. They didn't want this influx of the kind of masses. And if you hear like Norman Finkelstein talk about, his parents, who I think were Hungarian, Eastern European at least, working class, Jews who came in, that they were largely, treated poorly by the people in Brooklyn and that, who kind of looked down their nose at them. And so I think that's why we see, even the Balfour Declaration being, written to Rothschild, who used his clout to help get the Americans to come into World War I and help the British. And it's largely to do with a solution for these elites who had, good economically hegemonic positions in host countries, that they didn't want to be threatened by this influx of working class Jews. And so establishment of a Jewish state was useful to them in that project. Interestingly, the leaders of the Stern gang and the Irgun actually offered to work with the Nazis because, my enemy's enemy is my friend. And for the people who were blowing up the King David Hotel, the British were the enemy because the British were trying to help to establish a more circumscribed Jewish state in Palestine than the one that the kind of messianic, God's chosen people type theorists wanted to establish. They wanted a greater Israel that incorporated the Transjordan area too. And so as a result, you saw the right-wing Zionists try to collaborate with Mussolini and Hitler in order to help sabotage Britain. And there's a great deal of documentary evidence that's been brought forth to support that. As I say, Lenny Brenner is a journalist who lives in Brooklyn, and he uncovered all these primary sources from the archives in Israel and elsewhere. And he published his first book is called Zionism in the Age of Dictators. And then people asked to see his primary sources. So he edited a book, which were his primary sources that he used, which was like Eichmann's diaries, talking about how Eichmann learned Hebrew and went to hang out with the Zionists in Palestine and all these other things. Because they were trying to build relationships in order to sabotage British rule of Palestine. And so that's been the quagmire ever since. And so in the end, the labor current of Zionism, the labor faction in the Zionist movement that was collaborating with the British, they kind of won out. And then the state of Israel was established in the pre-1967 borders. And so what we saw in 1967 was the attempt to colonize the parts of Greater Israel that were excluded by the British Mandate Authority, and that the Labour Zionists had pragmatically consented to. And so
that almost led to World War III, because they attacked the USS Liberty. And when they attacked the USS Liberty, because the Liberty was a spy ship, well, it was more than just, roughly calling it a spy ship. It was the most modern, military communications platform ever at the time. And they were picking up the fact that not only were there war crimes going on with Egyptian soldiers being executed, but that Diane had wanted to go in and take the Sinai Peninsula as well. And they were sitting off the coast kind of like an insurance policy to be used so that the Johnson administration could spy on the Zionist regime. Because not a lot of people know that right before the 1967 war, that there had been a military coup inside of Israel. It was like 5 or 6 days before that whole thing started.
Well, and that's an expression of this factionalism that was going on in Israel. And then, of course, when you talk about bringing the world to World War III, during the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when the Egyptian forces tried to take back the Sinai Peninsula that Israel had colonized in 1967, Moshe Dayan told the U.S. government that he was pointing their nukes at Cairo, and that, unless that the Americans came and brokered a deal, that he would nuke Cairo. And so it really shows the extent to which the Israeli militarists are willing to go in order to achieve their empire. And of course, this goes back to the what I was saying on the previous show about Israel wanting to weaken its enemies. And we see now with these uprisings in Egypt that's a great way to do so, is to divide and rule Egypt and carve it up so it doesn't have the strength, for example, to dictate the terms of who's going to control the Sinai and so on.
Yeah, they wanted to go in there, and that was Johnson didn't trust them, and that's why they had the Liberty sitting there, and then they attacked the Liberty, and at first they thought it was the Egyptians that did it, and we had planes with nukes on them in the air. I mean, we could have turned Egypt into a plate of glass on a lie. That's how close it came. So yeah. It's a scary thought. We're going to break. We'll be right back. You're just telling us during the break. What were you just saying? Somebody wrote a book saying that the Smurfs are anti-Semitic?
Yeah. No, I'm not joking. I was on Facebook the other day and I saw someone had posted an article from a mainstream resource called the Telegraph paper in the UK, which is a prominent newspaper. And the article was reviewing a book written by a French scholar that was arguing that the Smurfs are anti-Semitic, and so everyone's anti-Semitic these days. It's quite fascinating.
Oh, man. That is too rich. That's just rich.
Apparently there was, anti-Semitic stereotypes or something like that. I mean, so this is obviously, it's kind of like the word conspiracy theorist. If you're tarnished as a conspiracy theorist or anti-Semitic, then you become a kind of an untouchable. But both are obviously ridiculous, because anti-Semitism is an irrational hatred of all Jews. And so if you're criticizing the state of Israel and its its politicians, then you're clearly only criticizing a few individuals.
Well, here's a perfect example.
You're not talking about some guy that's, some carpenter in Israel who goes to work and he's just trying to feed his family and put his. I get fed up with that whole discussion.
Here's a perfect example of how that's all a lie. Okay, go look how the U.S. media is not covering the protests. Okay, in Israel.
Inside of Israel,
400,000 people protested. It was either yesterday or the day before. Over 400,000 people were protesting the rights of people in Israel. And do you know what a lot of these protesters are saying when interviewed? We think that our government is going to start a war with somebody else to take the focus off of what's going on internally. And this is their own people in Israel that are protesting their government. They're calling them anti-government protesters. Okay, over 400,000.
But they're not anti-Semites, are they?
I'm sure they'll probably get labeled anti-Semites too. Well, that's why the news media here in the United States just won't cover it. Because how are you going to say that Jewish people, let me rephrase that, Israeli people are being anti-Semitic against themselves because they don't appreciate what their government is doing. They don't, more than about at least 50% of the population of Israel doesn't agree with what they're doing in Palestine with regards to Gaza.
Although some polls do show that like 80% of Israelis support it. So whilst I understand that even if 80% of Israelis support it, it's only because they've got propaganda done against them, just like the Americans.
Well, I don't trust most of those polls because that's the same kind of poll. You could switch a poll but in the blink of an eye, and a lot of times it's I have to trust who's doing the poll. Yes, there are people in Israel and yes, like when they attacked Gaza, like with Operation Cast Lead, the people of Israel the people that supported that should be ashamed of themselves. They should be. I have, my mother, rest her soul. She's not. She had very close friends that lived in Israel and stuff, and some of them. It's amazing because before we went into Iraq, they had made phone calls to her, and they, her friend had been former IDF, and they told my mother, "Hey, just keep an eye on the Middle East, keep an eye on Iraq," and she was told this like 6 to 8 months beforehand. And when I was in the military, I couldn't say anything, but my mother had told me the story later on when I had gone home on leave after the Iraq war had started and everything. And she was like, "Yeah, I knew this was going to happen months before. I had a feeling." And she said it because one of her friends that lived in Israel had told her, "Just keep an eye in the Middle East. That's all I know. That's the vibe that's coming through here. Keep an eye on Iraq. Keep an eye on Iraq." And now that doesn't mean she had any foreknowledge, but that's an Israeli citizen saying we feel that our government is up to something. So, but you don't see that on our news media. You don't see that at all. That's censored. You have to go on the alternative media and the internet to find that. And then, of course, there's the argument that anything on the internet is crazy talk.
Yeah,
isn't it?
Well, I think that's the big problem for those who did 9/11 was it happened to coincide with the age of the internet, and so in previous generations, if we'd just been reliant on mainstream media, we would have had all our skepticism excluded from the discourse. But because we have the internet, we can actually work together collaboratively like we're doing right now in order to work to distinguish between fact and fiction and to see through state-sponsored lies and myths. And I think
and make sure in 40 years, the story of 9/11 isn't like the story of John Kennedy. Like, yeah, we know, but what can you do now? The truth can come out so much faster, and people can be held accountable because they'll still be alive, even though they're, as Jim Fetzer would tell you, there's plenty of people still alive from the JFK assassination that could be held accountable.
Jim Fetzer just messaged me on Skype to say he's ready to contribute now if we could somehow bring him in.
I'll just pop him right into the chat.
Yeah, because actually Jim was just telling me yesterday, apparently a little old lady in Brooklyn called him up and said that her rabbi in their synagogue told them not to go in the Manhattan area on 9/11, and so like you're stating, a lot of the stuff that emanates from the higher echelons of Israeli society, the political conspiracies, there's even some consciousness in the lower down levels, of the Jewish community sometimes.
Well, when you go to check out when you go to check some of this stuff out and you go to talk about it, a lot of people come out with disinformation. No, that's wrong. The Israeli citizens were not told not to go into those buildings. But when you go and you ask people who will tell you they are Israeli citizens here working, whatever, and they were told, do not go down and do not go to work, what are you supposed to believe? Are you supposed to believe the mainstream media that says to you that lies, that's been proven to lie? It's not like not like I'm just saying it. You know what I mean? It's not like Josh is just saying it or JJ's just saying it. They prove they literally don't. We don't have to prove that they lie. They do a perfect job on their own. They show their hand all the time. They're constantly showing their hand. The mainstream media, that's why nobody believes them anymore. And that's why they have to bash us.
Yeah, and actually there were mainstream media reports about the Israelis who didn't go on 9/11, like Haaretz, which is quite a mainstream source in Israel, like a liberal newspaper in Israel. They reported that 2 employees of Odigo didn't go to work and were told not to, and they quoted the CEO of that company who said that. And so even when they might minimize or omit certain other aspects of that story, but there are some references to that concept in the mainstream media. But I was interviewed by one of Canada's highest circulation newspapers as we go into the 10th anniversary here the other day by a very brave journalist, and she told me about how her career had been hindered by the fact she's critical of Israel. And the first thing she said when she called me, practically the first thing was, don't talk about Israel and 9/11, even though I know that they're, relevant to each other. And so the mainstream media, it shows invariably aren't allowed to look for the scoop. One thing that I've encountered recently was, obviously I've been locking horns with Jonathan Kay here in Canada, is that he spreads the falsehood that, journalists just look for the scoop, and if your evidence on 9/11 was credible, we just report it. And that, he said, there's all these young contract journalists working for the National Post in Canada, for example, who would be looking for the scoop.
I am here.
This recent experience I've had with this journalist in Canada, who I won't name, but, is that she's suggested to me that she's not allowed really to publish the full truth pertaining to 9/11. And even her article that was, she very much cherry-picked what she was going to put into it. Even that got edited down by her editors. And so it's an indication that there isn't free speech when it comes to the mainstream media, and that invariably those who are partisan to the state of Israel are populated in the mainstream media, especially when it comes to like Middle East correspondence and so on. It seems there's kind of a monopoly on Middle East discourse to try and express the Israeli perspective on these matters.
Welcome back, Jim. I didn't want to interrupt you, Josh, but I brought Jim on while you were talking as we.
Isn't that great? Now, didn't I tell you, Popeye, you were going to love this guy?
Yeah, this has been a great couple hours so far.
Josh is full of information, man. And
I know, it's fantastic. And he's done all this research on the origins of the war on terror and traced it back even to a book by Benjamin Netanyahu published in 1986. I mean, this guy had a vision, Netanyahu. He could see how the West could be used to benefit Israel to reform the Middle East more to its liking. It's a stunning story.
It's a really good book to read. Alan Hart wrote it. It's called Zionism, the Real Enemy of the Jews.
Yes.
And he taught, Alan Hart's this former, for the listeners that don't know, he's this retired BBC journalist and reporter, whatever you want to call him. And he was on the ground, for the whole 67 war. And later on, years later, he interviewed, Netanyahu and Ariel Sharon. And Sharon admitted to him that there was no need for them to go into their there was no need for them to fight Egypt militarily because Egypt was not a threat, even though Egypt was standing up and being, loudmouth and playing right into it because there's always some schmuck dictator that'll take the fall. Okay, but when they're ranting and raving, or not, Egypt's ranting and raving meant nothing, and Israel knew that they militarily they smacked the crap out of them. That's why they won. It was like I think it was 40,000 poorly trained, poorly armed Egyptian soldiers with low morale versus 90,000 well trained, well equipped. And high morale Israeli troops. So who do you think's going to win? You're already outnumbered almost 2-1. Yeah. So and these guys have low morale.
This is a 6-day war where Moshe Dayan was running the shop, and the guy was a brilliant general. And it's also the interval during which the USS Liberty was attacked by Israeli ships.
Yep, I mentioned that earlier.
Torpedoed the ship and several times. They even strafed the life rafts to make sure there would be no survivors, which are international war crimes, and they were trying to blame it on Egypt to bring the U.S. into the war on their side. It's terrible, and when the admiral in the area launched American fighters to come to the defense of the Liberty, President Lyndon Johnson called him back.
It's a good illustration of the kind of control Israel lobbyists have on U.S. politicians, the fact that there was no retribution for the attack on the Liberty. It's an indication that when it comes to Israel, that U.S. politicians know what side their bread is buttered on, and they're not going to criticize Israel or even in any way, shape, or form try and prevent it from doing what it does. George Bush Sr., as I suggested, was really the only president. He started saying that U.S. loan guarantees to Israel were contingent on Israel trying to implement the two-state solution, and then all the Zionist lobbyists started supporting Clinton in order to oust Bush Sr. for having the audacity to stand up to Israel. And so that's led Professor James Fetzer to describe the U.S. empire as a colonized empire.
I'm going to cut you guys off. Josh, I'm going to cut you and James off. We're going to break. We'll be right back. Welcome back, guys. This is the second hour of Down the Rabbit Hole. This is Sunday, September 4th, 2011. I'm joined by my buddy JJink, my good friend Jim Fetzer, and researcher Joshua Blakeney. And I am just thrilled to have Jim and Josh on today because we have been having a very insightful conversation. And it's important for people to understand, how the reason why we're trying to go so into detail with everything is because we're trying to show you how interconnected everything is. Okay, we're trying to show you how all this stuff connects because it's a timeline of events. This 9/11 did not take place, over the course of a couple weeks. It was not planned over the course of a couple months. Okay, things like that take a long, long time to foment. And the people that do these kind of things have the utmost patience that you would not believe. It's incredible. Really quick, I want to touch on something, and then I'm not going to talk about it for the rest of the time that we're on air, and I don't care about it. Somebody asked me, somebody in the chat room said that Fetzer's a flip-flopper with Judy Wood. He's not a flip-flopper. Let me explain something really quick, okay? And then I'm not going to talk about it at all because I don't want to waste my time on it. Go back and listen to former interviews when Jim has been on my show, he's been on Bob Tuskin's show, and he's been on other radio shows. He never, ever, ever said that he agrees with the direct energy weapons theory. He's always said that Judy Wood has brought to light some good questions about certain damage to certain buildings and things, which she has, and other stuff, but he does not agree with the direct energy weapon stuff, so because the evidence doesn't support it. So there it is. He's not a flip-flopper. He's just telling you the way it is. Correct, Jim?
Well, it's that I haven't come down in favor of it because I think it's too vague, but I do think it deserves to be taken seriously along with the mini-nuke hypothesis. Those are the two that appear to me to still be viable. I've always been supporting research on Judy's work. I've always endorsed her studies of the evidence. And why that's so important is because that elaborates what we have to explain by an adequate theory. And whether Judy is willing to admit it or not, she obviously does have a theory because, for example, on the cover of her book, it states under the title, Evidence of Directed Free Energy Technology on 9/11, which of course means she believes directed free energy technology was used on 9/11. And while I consider that to be a possibility, I simply believe at this point the case has not been proven, but it's a fascinating situation. And she makes a lot of arguments that I think cannot be dismissed out of hand.
Exactly. And I don't think that we should see, I think to be dismissive in the quote unquote 9/11 truth movement or whatever, a community of citizens that wants the truth told, I don't believe that we should discount any theories. I think we should lay everything out on the table and then let the evidence discount the theories as each happens. So if I don't give any emotional attachment to any theory because if the evidence and it's clear cut and it's concise and it's real and it points to the fact that no, it wasn't that, out of 7 theories, it doesn't support 5 of them, and there's only 2 that are probable, and none of them is the government's theory. That goes right out the window with anything, okay? But you have to take every theory, okay? You have to take the government's theory so you could put it on the table and compare it with all these alternative theories and then compare the evidence to everything.
Government's theory breaks down at every angle.
Of course it does. But you know what? A lot of times some of these alternative theories do too. And that's a lot of times because there's some disinfo out there, which there is. But the only way to properly figure out what's crap and what's not is to put everything out on the table and then put the evidence out and eliminate stuff scientifically, correct?
Let me tell you a step in the right direction. Dwayne Dietz is a celebrated researcher, long time with NASA, and a very formidable guy. And I had him on my show a week ago, and he was talking about a study he'd done of the WTC-7, where he had considered 4 different theories. One was fire and gravity. Another was exotic accelerants, including nanothermite. The third was directed energy, and the fourth was nuclear devices. Now, what he's doing is systematically looking at the data and dividing it into 5 or 6 data sets and then figuring out which of these theories can provide the best explanation for each of the data sets. And he believes he can...
criteria.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. He concludes that there's a crucial feature here, which has to do with this temperature business and whether there really was molten metal for all that period of time. Frankly, I'm skeptical about the molten metal claims. It's a very peculiar thing. But depending on whether you go there, the molten metal makes a big difference in how the assessment comes out. Now, I'm going to get this up somewhere. I can probably find a link to it right now and tell you where you can send people to look at this because it's completely fascinating.
Needless to say, though, Jim, James, fire and gravity are the least probable, right?
Oh, of course. Oh, yeah. Oh, of course. And, I mean, it's easy to, and he excludes the first two completely, and the choice between the third and the fourth hinges very heavily on this temperature question. So the point is that, even 7 looks to be a bit more complicated than I thought. It always looked to me as a classic controlled demolition. And the point he's making is that it might have been done using a sophisticated technique like either directed energy or even mini nukes. I always assumed that was go ahead.
I think
Joshua.
what I've got out of, studying Professor Fetzer's work has been the concept of keeping an open mind and entertaining all the hypotheses. And I think what people make a mistake of doing is then inferring that Professor Fetzer is an advocate for such hypotheses rather than someone who merely defends the right of alternative hypothesizers to have their say. And for those who are advocates of a particular hypothesis, such as nanothermite theory, that those hypothesizers acknowledge the existence of these alternative hypotheses, of these alternative sort of challenges to their theory, and either assimilate their hypothesis into the to deal with the evidence as it emerges to refute their work, or to prove that the other theories are false and incorrect. In other words, it's merely a matter of acknowledging that one might be false. I think the word would be falsifiability, and if that potential exists, to either refute those who are challenging your hypothesis or adapt yours to conform with the new evidence.
I think what Joshua is trying to convey here is that you can't test an hypothesis in isolation. This is a blunder that Stephen Jones made early on. He thought that the scientific method was to make observations, form an hypothesis, conduct some experiments, and subject it to peer review. That's an inadequate conception. You can be stimulated by a puzzling situation and then speculate about the full range of alternative possible explanations, gather the relevant data, and figure what's the probability of that data if the hypothesis were true in order to calculate their likelihoods. And then by comparing their likelihoods, you can determine which is the best explanation of the evidence. And when there's enough evidence, you can accept the best explanation is true in the tentative and fallible fashion of science. But you can't tell what's an adequate explanation unless you compare it with the alternatives.
Right. Is it safe to say this, that the official story of what happened on September 11th and scientifically is the least likely to have happened?
Absolutely. Listen, it's preposterous.
Wouldn't that right there, isn't that enough to initiate a new investigation? I mean, isn't that enough just for us regular people to ask for one?
JJ, think about it. But who's going to conduct it? See, if you have it in Congress.
Yeah, who watches the watchers, Jim? Exactly.
We'll do it.
Does the Fox...
that's why
the investigations are already done.
The Fox already investigated that. The Fox already investigated the hen house.
That's right.
See, that's why I want. Before I let you go on, there's a point I want to add to what we were all saying about, and I'm not defending Jim, but using it as an example is because exactly what Joshua was saying. What happens is, some people get emotional attachments to certain theories or whatever, and I can understand how that happens. I'm not bashing anybody, but what happens is people don't use rational scientific thought. None of us. I'm not advocating any particular theory, except whatever I have said that I think. Like I said, I think there was a multiple use of multiple explosives on the towers and stuff, but. I'm not supporting any one theory. I'm supporting truth because we're only going to get one more shot at a real investigation because we can't keep dragging this on and on and on. So if we get another investigation, after that there isn't going to be, that was fake, blah, 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 blah. You know what I mean? So we have to get this right because we only got one shot at this. We're going to break. We'll be right back. We are back. Jim, I got a question for you.
Yeah, go.
And this is a super important thing to point out. Okay, and Joshua had brought it up earlier, and I forgot to talk about it last segment, and I want to make sure I touch on it right now before we forget. We were all talking about the red herring that is the Saudi connection. And when I say red herring, so people understand where, before I let Jim and Josh go off on this, because I'm going to let them both. I want Jim to give his thought, and I want Josh to give his thought. So I'm going to shut up after I ask this, after I explain this. I want people to understand what a red herring is. Not many people they think they know where the term comes from, but I'm going to let you know where the term comes from so people can understand what it is really quick. Okay. A couple hundred years ago, when people started domesticating dogs and stuff, and they were training hunting dogs, and it's a practice I'm sure that some hunters and trappers probably still do today to some degree or another. They would train the dogs to chase foxes or whatever they were chasing, whatever land-based game, and they didn't want the dog to become distracted from the scent. So they would have the trail and the scent line of what they were teaching it to chase, and then they would take fish, a red herring, because they stink, and they would take a couple of them, tie it to a line, and they would walk like 100 or 200 feet, straight line across the path. And it was so that when the dog was chasing the other animal, it would be running, and it would come across this other scent, and they were trying to train the dog to ignore the red herring smell and continue on its determined path. And they wanted it to overlook that red herring smell. So that's where the term red herring comes from. It comes from the practice of dog trainers leading trying to train a dog not to be led away by false trails. And that's what the Saudi connection kind of is, a false dead end. Because if you notice, the like I said during the break, they took those princes within a few months that were quote unquote involved in all this, and they all died of weird circumstances, and then that was it. There it dead ended, and anybody researching that end of it would be satisfied with that outcome and not dig any further.
Well, listen, this whole thing about 9/11 was cleverly designed with a whole lot of red herrings. Not just one, but a whole lot. And let me just mention two articles that'll give you the overview. One is called Peeling the 9/11 Onion, Layers of Plots Within Plots, which I co-authored with Preston James, who's an expert in covert ops. And then this new article with Joshua entitled The BBC's Instrument of 9/11 Misinformation, which, of course, is its series. Because between the two of them, you really get a good understanding what's going on. I mean, practically everyone forgets, and I can't believe even Kevin Barrett was questioning me when I was reminding him of this. Practically everyone forgets that the initial impression was to try to pin the tail on the Palestinians, so that when before the Twin Towers had even both been destroyed, there was an image of Palestinians cheering. Now, that turned out to have been archival footage. The Palestinians were all silent and disturbed. But they pulled it out from a religious holiday in Palestine. But the fact that they did it right there on 9/11. And then, of course, you had one of the anchors was saying this was the first report of responsibility. She said there's a claim of responsibility from the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And then when the dancing Israelis, these five Mossad agents who were dressed like Arabs in Liberty State Park, who'd been celebrating and filming the destruction of the Twin Towers, they were driving a white van from Urban Moving Systems, which is a Mossad asset. And when they were arrested, when they were finally stopped, the driver turned to the police officer and said, "We are Israelis. We are not your problem. Your problems are our problems. The Palestinians are your problem." I mean, can you believe it? Now, these guys were held for 71 days until an assistant to then Attorney General John Ashcroft directed that they be released. They went back to Israel. Three of them went on Israeli TV and explained they'd been there in Liberty State Park to document the destruction of the Twin Towers, which obviously implies foreknowledge. The individual who directed their release, get this, was Michael Chertoff, who is a joint U.S.-Israeli citizen and would become our director of Homeland Security.
And later, beyond a high-ranking member and a capitalizing monetarily on the naked X-ray body scanners.
I know it.
Microwave scanners.
It's disgusting. He's behind these
crap up, Jim. You can't. I couldn't call you up and sit down for 4 hours and come up with this kind of,
I know it.
Well, as I suggested earlier, those who plotted and schemed to implement the global war on terror were largely Zionists who have a geostrategic interest in discrediting the Saudi regime, right? And so when we discuss the people who are writing articles suggesting that Saudi Arabia somehow did 9/11, it is the mother of all red herrings. It's a lie-hop way of approaching 9/11. If you buy into the concept that bin Laden plotted 9/11, sent 19 Islamists to hijack 4 planes and implement the events of 9/11, then these talking about the bin Laden family and the Saudi Arabian potential connections to this issue is perhaps worthwhile. But when you look at the evidence, it implies that the alleged hijackers on 9/11 were neither associated with Osama bin Laden nor Islamists. As I suggested earlier, the evidence seems to imply that they were drinking vodka prior to 9/11, or at least some of them were, eating pork. One even blasphemed against Allah, attending strip clubs and hiring prostitutes, which would imply they're not Islamists willing to die for the Quran. And so therefore discussing the bin Laden family becomes irrelevant, especially when we then look at bin Laden's original testimony.
Wait, I got to interrupt. You mean to tell me fundamentalist Islamists that love, they want to kill America because of our freedoms and everything? Are you telling me that they don't do cocaine and drink and have stripper girlfriends? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
Yeah, well, actually, it's interesting because it seems that there isn't an official explanation for that. It's funny because I was debating this in my university once with one of the stooges of our right-wing political science department, this student, and he said, "Oh no, there's something in Islam that allows you to experiment with prohibited things if you're going to do a jihad or something."
That's right.
So he has there's actually an official explanation for that. But then, of course, when we look at bin Laden's original testimony, where he was saying, I'm only interested in decolonizing Palestine and I have no interest in attacking the states, and as a Muslim I wouldn't do this, that then means that any discussion of the bin Laden family is completely irrelevant to the events of 9/11 because the accused has denied any involvement in it. And there's moreover, there's evidence that he was strapped to a dialysis machine in a hospital in Rawalpindi in Pakistan prior to 9/11, in a couple of days prior to 9/11, and in months prior to 9/11 was in the Dubai hospital meeting with the CIA. And as a result, I think we can.
That's well documented, even the mainstream.
Those writing articles drawing attention to the Saudi very tenuous connections to the events of 9/11, whilst ignoring the very egregious Israeli fingerprints or handprint that's on the events of 9/11.
Yes.
That such people, aren't being sincere and are in fact quite dubious when they engage in such red herringhood.
You're gonna love this story. When I would, in my critical thinking classes, explain to my students that in Islam, the consumption of alcoholic beverages is absolutely forbidden, and there is no sex permitted outside of marriage, there was a noticeable diminution in enthusiasm for conversion.
Right. Yeah. They're into the American religion.
We're going to break, guys. Hang out. Stay there. We'll be right back.
For the corporation, I run out of patience, sick of seeing troops sink to die for your lives. Spending dollars in debt, we holler in protest till we have your arrest. We will not rest, and we know what you did that day. Kill your own citizens to advance your ways.
It's fascinating that just after 9/11, right, there was a whole bunch of books came out talking right away that were probably written prior to 9/11, talking about bin Laden connections, which were really the sources that fed into Michael Moore's documentary. And so
probably just
even
before
David Ray
9/11
Griffin,
got him.
early on in his book.
We are back. JJ, during the break, you really actually were bringing up a good point, how now, like right before the 10th anniversary, you got this whole little fake orchestrated for television, drama going on with Cheney and Condoleezza Rice, and him putting out a book. And now he's saying some stuff different than Bush. What were you saying that there's what's the drama between Condoleezza and Cheney?
Are you asking me that?
Yeah, you were talking about it.
Oh, Well, I actually wasn't prepared to answer that question. Well, okay, so in his book, I know we were talking about it, but I wanted to bring up this article so I could be implicit about it. But anyways, yeah.
Just give it a quick
So apparently now there's this, this little bit of drama about some things that maybe Dick Cheney wrote in his book about how Condoleezza Rice had come in with tears, into his office. So
come into Cheney's office.
Yeah, so why don't we just wait?
Or what was it about? Do you know?
Yeah, in regards to 9/11, in regards to Iraq.
So it's more just drama for the.
Well,
yeah, because they were both liars. They both had foreknowledge. They were both in on it.
His book, in his interviews, he just blatantly comes out and says he's for, torture was awesome. We should do it again. We should waterboard everybody. We should waterboard nuns.
He's a completely unscrupulous person. He has no sense of ethics or morality.
He's got a fake heart, Jim. So he's a
moral cretin. Oh, does he have a Jarvik artificial heart?
Oh, yeah. He doesn't have one installed yet. His heart's no good, so he's got one of them things on his hip.
Condoleezza Rice claims that he's attacking her integrity.
They were sacrificing children to replace Cheney's body parts.
Cheney's coming to Canada.
He eats live stem cells.
He eats babies. Are you kidding me? Dick Cheney's evil, and if anybody can't see that, I love Fox News always does. President Cheney, you're always getting picked on. People, you have enemies, and he's like, yeah, I get unfairly picked on. Really? Really? Why don't you ask Kathy O'Brien if she thinks that you get unfairly picked on, you savage bastard?
You know how obviously some European countries have successfully deterred people like Bush and Cheney from coming to visit their countries. A good example is Switzerland. The people in Switzerland mobilized enough to pressure their law enforcement officials to actually uphold their war crimes legislation, which led Bush to cancel his visit to Switzerland. And right now we have a situation where Cheney's coming into Vancouver to do a speech and promote his book towards the end of the month, towards the end of September.
Let me straighten out what I said so people don't think I'm a moron. It was actually in regards to North Korea and nuclear weapons. So, sorry, man.
No, but again, there you go.
But again, it's this little fake drama between two people on the same team. Dick Cheney's attacking her integrity, saying that she misled the president. Again.
Well, who gave North Korea the weapons? And that's actually a good example, by the way, JJ, because it just goes to show you that once they're not in the clique with each other anymore, how fast they turn on one another. Because they're all they eat their own, and they're venomous little snake. If Ike's right and they really are reptilians, it wouldn't surprise me because they act like cold-blooded creatures. They don't. They would crawl over their dying mother to F their sister. That's the old saying, and that's exactly what these guys would do. They do not care. They're heartless. Look what they do. Killing. Look, 1.5 million Iraqis. Whether they were fighting, whether maybe 2% of them were fighting the U.S. forces or not is irrelevant. Okay, there's at least 98% of them were innocent women, men, and children, and these people have been eradicated from the planet, erased from existence, based on what? Based on not us, our retarded government, and then the apathy of the general public not caring and caring more about their damn SUVs than anything else. That really sickens me. And American people today are just as guilty as the German people were during World War II they were held accountable. Patton wrote about it. He was sickened by what he was ordered to do. They took the houses from the German people that did just civilians. They weren't involved with the Nazi regime, nothing. They were thrown out of their houses, and all their possessions and homes were given to people from the concentration camps that had been liberated. Okay, and I'm not saying that the people in the camps, didn't deserve to have something, but the thing is, we didn't build them homes and put them in it or anything like that. No, we displaced other people from their homes and put these displaced people in their homes. Okay, so we created more problems. But aside from that, the point is the fact that the people of Germany were held responsible, okay? And the American people that do not stand up and say this is wrong and just go along to get along are just as wrong as the German people that did it. It does not matter.
I always say if you look at the polls done by the Pew Research Group, two of the top countries in terms of popularity in the world are Germany and Japan. I think that's a reflection of the fact that they actually had a defeat inflicted upon them, which made them become introspective and reflect on their own inadequacies and racist supremacism and so on. And I think the best thing that can happen to the US, but also to Israel especially, which is this kind of crazy ethnic nationalist expansionist state, is for it to have a defeat inflicted upon it, which might actually make it become a little bit introspective and reflect upon the way it's allowed itself to become such a rapacious and misanthropic polity.
Humble pie is always a good thing to keep you centered, isn't it?
But the problem is at the very core, you still have the Rothschilds and people like them that are hardcore and will not, they will not falter on their quest for domination of the entire planet.
Because they're almost there.
Well, they're that close. I'm pinching my fingers together. They're that freaking close. They're not going to want to give it up now.
The ones that are alive now know that this was started by people. Well,
here's the question.
They were brought into this when they were young, and they're just hoping. They're seeing the end in sight, and maybe they're going to be able to get this done before they die and see it in their generation instead of just their children and their grandchildren. That's how they think. They don't think about the easy button and it's got to be done tomorrow morning. This was started long, long ago.
Well, here's the problem, and here's the question. Okay, the problem is that at the very heart, even if the Israeli people
started during Napoleon, right?
Well, they were around before that, but they were around before that. They gained a lot of. That's how they took control of London. Was through the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Anyway, the Rothschilds, no matter what, they still control the very heart of Israeli politics, and it's scary because even now you see the citizens of Israel standing up against their government and saying enough is enough. And I mean, it's just like if they ignore it, it's not happening. And these people are so nuts. It makes you wonder what lengths they're willing to go through. To succeed. I mean, they made it against the law for their own citizens to protest against what they're doing in Gaza.
Million dead Iraqis, according to Susan Lindauer, during the sanctions in the 90s, 2 or 4 million dead Iraqis. 2 million babies.
The sanctions after the first Gulf War killed more people.
They will go to any lengths, is what I'm saying. Death does not matter at all to them.
Dude. Because we bombed the hell out of all their infrastructure and then wouldn't let them import anything to fix it. And then every time they did have something operating, we blasted the crap out of it. And we did the same thing to Libya. So who's going to go in there and
50,000 dead in Libya so far, right?
But who wants to bet DynCorp and Halliburton will be inside Libya in the next 6 months, rebuild?
Halliburton and Carlyle.
The Carlyle Group and all that.
The protests in Israel, though, like I got phoned by Press TV to do an interview on them the other day, and I couldn't help wondering whether they were somehow orchestrated or manufactured by left gatekeepers, because actually the demands of the Israeli protesters were primarily not to do with the Palestinians, but to do with domestic issues, to do with the economy and with housing. And so you had this protest emerge where they were asking for new, cheaper and more affordable housing. And then suddenly the Israeli government announced they're going to do a whole new set of settlements in the West Bank, which will create a line of settlements dividing Bethlehem from East Jerusalem. And this happens to just coincide with the possible declaration of a Palestinian state in the United Nations. And so we know that throughout history that left-wing protest movements have been infiltrated. In fact, apparently during the Cold War, the Communist Party of the USA had more FBI agents than communists. And therefore, one cannot help wonder whether that in Israel's attempt to sabotage the declaration of a Palestinian state that's forthcoming.
They used to have communist cell meetings where everyone there was an FBI informant.
So they just stopped it. It makes one wonder if they stopped, if they took the guise of communist off for a second. It was like, hey, everybody here, Fed school. Okay, so how was the office today? Anybody know what's going back on? Blah, 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 blah. We're going to break, guys. We'll be right back.
Okay.
And I am North and South Dakota.
Away from the guilty.
People are always asking me.
You see? George Bush was telling you, don't believe me, don't believe Dick Cheney, don't believe the man. BS lies.
Because we have the most outrageous theory of them all.
Exactly. If you believe
the most scientifically unviable.
It's indefensible. Absolutely indefensible.
Didn't you know, JJ, that Osama bin Laden with a laptop could actually defy gravity as well as beat Orion?
He changed Einstein's theory.
You want to talk about the ultimate hacker, right? That you're talking about.
Listen. You want to get Joshua to talk about Bush coming to Canada.
Okay, splitting the sky. Because that is really cool.
Yeah.
It was classic. The videos are awesome.
Yeah, we're back, Josh. Actually, I got a question. One of the people in the chat room, it's a question I told you about during the break. They had asked what your take is about Venezuela, and you said that you actually had a really interesting story about Venezuela.
Well, yeah, I basically, my main political cause prior to becoming a 9/11 truther was really drawing attention to the positive aspects of the Bolivarian revolution that's happening in Latin America. My first protest that I went to in London, just after the big one in 2003 in London, when I was still living there, was obviously against George Bush's visit to London at that time. And I actually ended up going to an event where I met members of the Venezuelan government. And then in 2008, I went to the International Conference of Solidarity in Havana. On May 1st, I stood about 10 meters below Raul Castro in Plaza de Revolucion in Havana. And then I attended this conference. And you know how much they censor any debate and stuff in our countries. Well, in Cuba, we have this huge forum where there's a massive room, and people come from Venezuela, Guatemala, Nicaragua. People have been tortured, for being progressive people. And we have earpieces translated into like 10 languages, and we sit and just have a conversation about imperialism and stuff. It's really an amazing event. And so I had a chance to encounter both Cuban elected officials. They have elections in Cuba, even despite the disinformation that you hear about it, and members of the Bolivarian Revolution. And all I can say is that Hugo Chavez is one of the greatest human beings ever to be on our planet, and he's trying his best. Along with he's the most democratically elected leader in the world. I think he's put himself to the electorate something like 11 times for either referenda or general elections, and has been elected about, I think, out of 10 out of the 11 times his things have been endorsed by the electorate of Venezuela. And so him trying to now control the gold reserves indicates that he's going to be possibly the next target of imperialism. I really am quite sanguine about the fact that the Venezuelan government are collaborating with the Iranian government in order to develop both nations. I think it would be good for the American hemisphere to have a united and strong Latin American Bolivarian project. They're even talking about doing their own currency and stuff. And there's a project called ALBA in which they're doing like health projects with Cuban doctors, training doctors from all around the
that's America. The death knell right there. That's it. You just said that's the death blow. That's the same thing that Libya was doing. Gaddafi.
Well, likewise, in the Middle East, if Iran becomes stronger and stronger, then it might create some balance of power in the region. And in the American hemisphere, I think it would be good if we didn't have this kind of Monroe Doctrine anymore, and that we actually had a strong Latin America that can develop its own people. And, to be quite honest, as a Marxist, you look at, like, for example, the Communist Party of China got so much disinformation against it. That's liberated more people out of poverty than any government in the history of the world. The Communist Party of China took a backward feudal system and took 500 million people out of poverty, the greatest elevation of human beings out of poverty in history. I hope, likewise, just as China unified its disparate provinces and unified the people under one language, Mandarin, in order to elevate them out of the shackles imposed by imperialism upon them, that the Venezuelan people and the people of Latin America can succeed in their Bolivarian revolution in order to resist the imperialism that's killed millions and millions of people through structural issues of poverty and so on. And so I'm hoping that likewise in the Middle East, with Iran becoming prosperous. Now I'm going to talk about Calgary in March.
Joshua, let me interject here just a moment, which is this. When you describe yourself as a Marxist, you mean you believe strongly in economic determinism of political systems and so forth. You don't mean that you're advocating the violent overthrow of the government. You don't mean that you're a member of the Communist Party in the sense in which the FBI was seeking to track them down. So my remark before, when I said there were 6 Marxists in the United States, I meant 6 who believe in totalitarianism and violent overthrow of the government and all that, which is not.
And 4 of them are FBI agents.
Yeah. which is not what you mean. Which is not what you mean when you describe yourself as a Marxist.
Well, yeah, and the beauty of what's going on in Latin America is that it's largely democratic revolutions. As I just said, Hugo Chavez is the most elected leader on the planet. I don't think there's any leader who's put himself to the electorate 11 times in a decade.
Yeah. I admire him too. He, like Fidel Castro, wants to use the natural resources of their country to benefit their citizens. I mean, what's wrong with that? Is that it cuts down on the profit margins of the exploitative corporations who want to go in there and take advantage of their resources for their own benefit, not for that of the Cuban or Venezuelan people.
And throughout history, whenever there's been indigenous leaders who've tried to control their own resources, they've invariably been taken out. For example, in the Congo, their first president was a postal union leader called Patrice Lumumba, and he got taken out by the CIA, and they called him the Fidel Castro of Africa. When people call us conspiracy theorists, talk to the Cubans, they say their war on terror began in 1959 when the U.S. started trying to sabotage them. If you go to the U.S. has a kind of consulate in Havana, and the Cuban government have put big black flags all around it, as each flag represents one terrorist attack the United States has done on the island of Cuba. Yes. They tried to poison cigars to blow up Fidel. They tried to put... there's a documentary called 300 Ways to Kill Castro that illustrates all the conspiracies the CIA engaged in order to
they took a cure for cancer that they knew that they had put inside of it. They had inadvertently put inside of a polio vaccine and then given to 100 million people.
You mean a cause of cancer? You said cure.
Yes.
You meant a cause.
Yeah, excuse me. Well, the cause of cancer was put in there, and then they were creating a cure for it. And the CIA took this cure, this search for the cure, and this quest for the cure, and turned it into the search and creation of a bioweapon to kill Castro with cancer in 28 days. And amazingly, what's
Judith?
His name? Judith worked on it, but
Judith Baker was involved in that with David Ferry and Lee Oswald and Mary Sherman. And,
you know what Jack Ruby said a couple days before he died, right? He said that he had been injected with cancer cells, and it took exactly 28 days from the time that he was diagnosed till the time he died, which Judith said was the gestation period of the cancer that they worked on.
Yeah.
Well, Viktor Ostrovsky, the Mossad whistleblower, he talks about in his book going down to South Africa and seeing these Israelis always claim they send doctors to third world countries to help the people there, but he talks about going down to this hospital in Soweto, I think it was, and that these Mossad agents were experimenting drugs on blacks in Africa. And actually, I have this great book called Medical Apartheid, authored by Harriet Washington, who's a lecturer in bioethics at Tuskegee University. And at Tuskegee prison, it was infamous where the U.S. government tested different different chemicals. But it turns out, and even she cites this in her book, and she's actually lectured at Stanford, Harvard, she's a bioethics lecturer, that Israel, the IDF actually boasted that they were working with the South African government on a race-specific bioweapon, because obviously if the South African government released a bioweapon that could kill white people, it would have been against the perpetuation of their apartheid system. Likewise, even though Israel has nukes, it can't really use them because there'd be negative effects in the region for their own people. And so that and this was actually reported in the mainstream media sources such as the Times of London, that the Israeli government were trying to manufacture a weapon that could kill just Arabs, because obviously race is 99.9% bullshit, but there's like a small aspect that do differ between different ethnic groups on in certain biological ways, and that if they can tap into that and release a weapon that can kill just Arabs, for example, that would be a good way of them attaining hegemony and by creating more strife for the Arab people.
And that's not a stretch of the imagination either, because the CIA has for years been working on weapons that they could specifically target. Like if they wanted a dictator, say they would target we'll say 10 different genetic factors about him, and they would create a poison that would only target somebody with those 10 specific genetic factors. So they would spray this stuff from an airplane over a city, and out of 50,000 people, maybe a couple hundred would drop dead, including their intended target. So yeah, there would be some collateral damage, but they were able to get the guy with bioweapons that were specifically designed to attack specific things that person held genetically. So I mean, and that's not new. This is going back years, so you can only imagine what we don't know about.
Yeah, I mean, they gave Native Americans smallpox infested blankets, and so germ warfare and chemical, doing.
Yeah, this isn't new. This is an old
for a
practice.
long time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sending over, rancid beef over the walls of a castle.
Well,
To fester disease
these people
during sieges.
This is the thing as well. When we talk about the war on terror, of course, during the Cold War, they actually had a stable and tangible enemy, namely the Soviet Union. But what they did in the Cold War was any indigenous peoples who tried to nationalize and control their resources, they were instantly demonized as communists. But even though that typically they did socialism with indigenous characteristics, such as in Nicaragua, they weren't atheistic. Much of the Sandinista revolutionary government were actually Catholic priests who were Marxists. And so when we see the end of the Soviet Union, we then saw the fact that there was actually no enemy for various imperialist agendas. And so one had to be manufactured, and that's what we've seen is the illusion created to justify the perpetuation of military profiteers and so on. But primarily the state of Israel has also been able to sell its enemy as the enemy of a broader empire. And so I think it's very important to have an awareness when we're talking about Venezuela about the war against the...
All right, I got to cut you guys off really quick. Nate, give your website out, Josh, because you're going to get cut off in about 30 seconds.
JoshuaBlakeney.info.
Jim, give your website out.
Go to Veterans Today, Jim Fetzer. You'll find all my columns, including one I've just co-authored with Joshua Blakeney.
Thank you guys for coming on the show. It's been great. JJ, thanks for hanging out. Listeners, thanks for hanging out for 4 hours. I'll see you guys on Wednesday. I'm out of here.